Africa in history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today PAM. The Pan-African movement since 1900 present PAM. This refers to the black intellectual movement that was intended to jointly unite the blacks all over the world. It was founded in 1900 by men like William S. V. Elvester, George Padmore from Trinidad and Tobago, W. E. B. Du Bois from the Caribbean islands, and many others who were renowned lawyers and professors. They were interested in the pride of African race. Pan-Africanism is divided into two phases, i.e., the first phase was in the diaspora and conferences took place in Europe and America, i.e., London Conference of 1900, 1919 Paris Conference, 1921. Conference held in the capitals of Paris, London and Brussels, 1927 New York Conference and the 1945 Manchester Conference 5th PAC. NB, the Manchester Conference was dominated by many African delegates from both African and the European countries, and this compelled Marcus Garvey to comment that if Europe is for Europeans, then the Negroes must claim Africa as their home. Second phase of Pan-Africanism. This phase was dominated by all Africans and it took place in Africa. This is because PAM had got a home base when Ghana got its independence in 1957 and it began with the 1958 conference in Accra, the April for African Independent Countries, December for All African Peoples, Conference APC. Aims and objectives of PAM. It aimed at promoting and forging unity for all the blacks all over the world regardless of their education and economic levels. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date PAM. To uplift the African interests and the desire to develop. To eradicate interstate conflicts out of the entire African continent. To ensure the respect and dignity of African sovereignty and territorial integrity and independence. To uplift African standards of living and curb down the biting poverty on the continent. To enforce economic integration in order to end the economic exploitation of Africans. To promote technological transfer from the New World to Africa, i.e., Africans getting to know the recent sciences and technology to promote development and propel themselves. Factors for the development and growth of Pan-Africanism. 1. European colonialism and exploitative policies. 2. The influence of the blacks in the diaspora, i.e., George Padmore. 3. The Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. 4. The impact of the Manchester Conference in 1945. 5. The role of the Black Students' Movement WASU since 1945. 6. The impact of the apartheid policy in South Africa in 1948. 7. The role of the Egyptian Revolution under Nasser in 1952. 8. The impact of Bandung Conference of 1955. 9. Ghana's independence/role of Nkrumah 1957. 10. The independence of Guinea-Conakry/role of Sékou Touré 1958. 11. The role of the Accra Conference of 1958. 12. The role of mass media and the press. 13. The formation of political parties. 14. The role of artists/and EDI, Lucky Dube, Chinua 8. 15. The role of African elite/impact of Western education. 16. The formation of OAU in 1963. Factors explained. 1. European colonialism and the exploitative policies led to the development of PAM. These policies were the same in all African countries and they compelled the blacks to share experiences and lay strategies that brought them together to fight colonialism jointly. 2. The influence of the blacks in the diaspora like W. E. B. Du Bois, William Sylvester, Marcus. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today PAM. 3. The impact of the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 led to the growth of the Pan-Africanism. Ethiopia served as African model for independence and confirmed African solidarity evidenced by the strikes in West Africa led by Nnamdi Ezekwe hence it inspired the African continent to help Ethiopians to restore their independence in 1941. 4. The role of the Manchester Conference in 1945 greatly influenced the development of Pan-Africanism. This conference was organized by W. E. B. Du Bois assisted by Nkrumah and it was vastly attended by African delegates. The conference inspired Africans to become militaristic in order to get independence. It equipped African leaders with leadership skills and encouraged African nationalists to form political parties. 5. The renewed activities of WASU in 1945 led to the development of Pan-Africanism. This body identified itself with all Africans that were struggling for their independence. They extended moral, financial, and military support to the suffering Africans leading to the development of PAM. 6. The impact of the apartheid regime in South Africa since 1948 led to the development of Pan-Africanism. This was discriminative and segregative that made the people of South Africa to suffer in establishment zones where life was very hard. Therefore, African countries under OAU and the frontline states offered assistance to help South Africa get its independence, leading to Pan-Africanism. 7. The role of Egyptian revolution under Nasser in 1952 led to the development of PAM. Nasser, upon getting complete independence for Egypt, extended support to liberation movements, i.e. FLN of Algeria offered Radio Cairo to be used by the MAU fighters, provided asylum to suffering Africans like Musazi of Uganda hence Pan-Africanism. 8. The positive impact of the Bandung Conference in 1955 influenced the development of PAM. This conference was attended by African nationalists like Nasser, Jomo Kenyatta, Kamuzu, Banda that brought Africans together, consolidated their unity, and increased their commitment for independence, hence PAM. 9. Ghana's independence in 1957 led to the development of PAM. Ghana's independence under Nkrumah made a strong stride in African history by helping African countries like Guinea-Conakry through financial aid using the budget of Ghana. This forced Africans to form close ties like Ghana-Guinea, Mali Union. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. 10. The independence of Guinea-Conakry / role of Sékou Touré led to PAM. Sékou Touré encouraged Africans to form unions and federations that would address Africans' problems. He adopted African socialism that was embraced by Julius Nyerere under Ujama. This brought Africans together to promote economic prosperity that finally weakened colonialism in Africa. 11. The role of the Accra Conference held in Ghana in 1958 influenced the formation of PAM. The conference united both independent and struggling African countries. It shifted PAM Africanism from the diaspora, and it got a home in Africa. It militarized African nationalism and encouraged the formation of political parties to capture power from the colonialists. 12. The role of the press and mass media had a strong impact on the growth of PAM. The newspapers like Western African Palette by Nnamdi Ezekibwe, the Accra Evening News by Nkrumah, and the Radio Cairo by Nasser that spread anti-colonial propaganda, all revived African culture and condemned colonialism, thereby rekindling the spirit of nationalism. 13. The formation of political parties in Africa led to the development of these parties like PAIC, MPLA, FLN, Frelimo, UNC solicited for assistance from external sources like superpowers, united Africans and sensitized them about the need for independence, adopted radical strategies to attain independence. 14. The role of artists and Ndidi such as Lucky Dube, Chinua Achebe, these brought messages that condemned colonialists. These writers encouraged Africans to identify themselves with their culture and resist from cultural manipulation, leading to the development of PAM. 15. The role of African elite / Western education greatly influenced the development of PAM. The Africans who acquired colonial education like Kamuzu Banda, Kenneth Kaunda got exposed to the life of the colonial world. They exchanged ideas with the civilized and democratic people of France and America. These ideas changed the thinking of African elites to unite and form African government. 16. The formation of OAU in 1963 led to the growth of PAM. OAU united Africans on the continent. It colonized African countries for extension of aids using its liberation committees. It imposed sanctions on colonial masters in South Africa, Southern Rhodesia. It encouraged economic prosperity through formation of regional bodies like COMESA, EAC that united Africans. PUN. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. 1. Account for the development of PAM since 1945. 2. Explain the factors that led to the growth of PAM. Manchester Conference of 1945, the fifth PAC. The MC was the fifth and the last conference held in the diaspora. It was chaired by W.E.B. Du Bois and assisted by George Padmore and Quaim as co-secretaries. It was attended by very many African delegates including Jomo Kenyatta and Patrice Lumumba, etc. The contribution of MC to the growth of PAM. The conference brought the aspect of Africa for Africans. This is because the conference was dominated by nationalists from various parts of the African continent, leading to PAM. The conference equipped African leaders with leadership skills. This included Nkrumah, Kamuzu Banda, which they used in their respective countries to offer leadership role that made the countries get independence. It militarized African nationalism. The liberation fighters in Africa were encouraged to adopt military approaches in order to uproot colonialism, i.e. Mau Mau fighters in Kenya, FLN in Algeria and Kamuzu Banda in Dar es Salaam, Malawi. It encouraged African nationalists to form massive political parties that led to their respective countries to independence, which include CPP by Nkrumah in 1949, Milton Obote formed UPC in 1959, and CNC in Nigeria. These parties sensitized and united Africans for a common cause of independence. The conference made the Africans to agree to sell the idea of PAM to Africa. It therefore shifted Pan-Africanism from the diaspora to Africa, and it laid a foundation in the acquisition of a base in Ghana following the independence of Ghana in 1957. The conference brought together Africans for Africa and those in the diaspora. It fostered unity among Africans in order to share strengths to fight colonial tendencies in Africa. It encouraged African delegates to return home and provide leadership to the independence struggles. This is clearly evident when the attendants like Jomo Kenyatta and Quaim Nkrumah came back to prepare their countries for independence. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. The African freedom fighters involved the illiterate peasants into the struggle against European domination, i.e. cow, og. It openly criticized and launched intellectual attacks on the negative colonial policies within and outside Africa. The conference condemned the inhuman exploitation of Africans through forced labor, land grabbing, denial of political rights. It advocated for cultural revival among the African states. The delegates were concerned with the abuse of African cultural values like introduction of Christianity and colonialism by Europeans. The Congress led to the formation of the West African National Secretariat in 1945. This was composed of West African politicians staying in UK and France such as Danquah. These condemned the atrocities of the white men. It encouraged African unity and solidarity. This helped Africans to cooperate in order to win their independence the way Liberia and Ethiopia enjoyed the fruits of independence. The Manchester Conference laid a foundation for future conferences, i.e., Accra Conference of April and December in 1958 that was organized by Kwame Nkrumah, the Cairo Conference, the U1963 Conference in Addis Ababa, and all these brought Africans together to fight for their independence. It strongly condemned racism in Africa and the African continent. The representatives agreed to treat the black race equally and therefore attacked the apartheid regime in South Africa. It increased the activities of WASU, which had been formed in 1920 by Soyinka Dipo. WASU became more radical and attacked colonial masters all over Africa and demanded the implementation of the 1941 Atlantic Charter. QN 1. To what extent did the 5th PAC contribute to the growth of PAM? 2. Examine the impact of the Manchester Conference to the development of PAM. 4. Assess the role of the Manchester Conference to the growth of African nationalism. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date, PAM. In BQN 1, 2, 3 are two-sided and 4 and 5 are one-sided. Accra Conference 1958. The Accra Conference was held in April 1958 for the independent African countries and in December for All African Peoples Conference OPC that included over 25 African countries. The major aim of these conferences were to fight colonialism, racism and bring Africans together, and even Nelson Mandela escaped from South Africa to attend the conference. It was organized shortly after the independence of Ghana, and Nkrumah clearly stated that today is African independence and tomorrow is the United States of Africa. Role/impact of the Accra Conference. The conference provided a platform for the interaction of African nationalists. They shared a lot in common regarding the strategies for achieving African independence, and leaders like Pedros Lumumba were equipped with leadership skills. It emphasized consolidated unity of Africans. Africans were equipped with cultural and economic skills that would make them unite and move forward as a continent. The nationalists agreed to establish a base for PAM in Africa, and therefore Ghana became a home for revolutionary fighters in Africa. The theme of the conference made Pan-Africanism practical and militant. It quickened the demand for immediate independence that led to a speedy move to fight colonialism. The delegates at the conference agreed to ensure the respect for African leaders, territorial African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date, PAM. It condemned colonial rule in the strongest terms. The participants jointly condemned the negative policies in Africa, more so in Portuguese Africa, South Africa and South Rhodesia. It enhanced the policy of INAM among the African states. This was intended to prevent African countries to join Cold War politics, which would divide African countries on ideological grounds of the West and East, and Nkrumah said, "We face forward, not East or West." It bridged the gap between the Arab North and the Black South. Nkrumah went ahead and unified the blacks of the South with the Arab North, i.e., Algeria, Egypt, etc., in order to fight for the independence of African continent. It acted as a basis for the formation of OAU in 1963. It was through the Accra Conference that Africans thought of having a regional body that would bring African countries together to fight for their independence. It also laid a foundation for other African conferences, i.e., November 1959 Conference in Cairo, 1960 Tunisia Conference, 1963 in Addis Ababa, intended to unite Africans. It laid a foundation for regional groups, i.e., Ghana-Guinea-Mali Union, and has brought Africans together. Also, ECOWAS was formed in 1976 to promote regional cooperation in Africa. It depicted Ghana as a model country which inspired other African nationalists to fight for their independence due to the numerous changes economically, politically and socially which were copied by countries like Angola in 1961, Mozambique 1964 and Guinea, Bissau in 1963. It encouraged the Africans' religious leaders in the struggle for independence. Leaders in Africa agreed that religious leaders would bring people together through their preaching, and also encouraged African leaders to think beyond political lines. It inspired militant nationalism in Africa. It encouraged the formation of radical liberation movements in Africa, i.e. SWAPO, ZANU, MPLA, FRELIMO, which finally weakened colonialism and led to independence. PAM 1. To what extent did Accra Conference contribute to the growth of PAM? African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date, PAM. Nkrumah attended MC in 1945 and contributed to its resolutions like shifting Pan Africanism from the diaspora to Africa, forming political parties, which he did in 1949. He was a brain behind the formation of Ghana, Guinea, Mali Union that emphasized African unity geared towards Pan-Africanism. He appointed George Patmore to be his advisor on African issues from Trinidad. Nkrumah gave a £10 loan to Guinea-Conakry in 1958 when the French had cut ties from his country, i.e. Sékou Touré. He gave scholarships to Africans, and this increased the level of literacy in Africa, ending poverty and empowering Africans economically. Nkrumah extended financial, material, and propaganda support to nationalists and liberation fighters, i.e. ANC in South Africa. He opposed secessionist movements in Africa, i.e. Katanga secession of 1960–1963, hence encouraging continental democracy in Africa. Nkrumah laid the ground and mooted the idea of the United States of Africa, which was geared towards Pan-Africanism. He expressed solidarity with the blacks in southern Rhodesia, i.e. current Zimbabwe, when he sent the army to fight the government of Ian Smith. He provided military bases and training grounds for the liberation fighters in Africa to organize for their independence. He provided political asylum and assisted the political fugitives to settle, and has helped to organize themselves in order to attack their colonial masters. He condemned nuclear tests in Algeria during the Liberation War. He did this using the platform of the UN. He changed the name Gold Coast to Ghana in memory of the ancient Ghana Kingdom, which was a direct reflection of the objectives of PAM to revive African culture. He organized and hosted a number of conferences, including OPC in December 1958, that brought Africans together. He married an African lady from Egypt on the advice of Nasser Fasha, hence embracing African modernity and cross-cultural management. He was a strong supporter of NAM, which in turn boosted PAM. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. He condemned neo-colonialism in Africa and referred to it as a secondary form of colonialism that had to be fought by Africans in the strongest terms. He stimulated Pan-African sentiments through his writings of articles, i.e. Africans must unite, we move forward and backward never. QN examined the role of Sékou Touré to the growth of Pan-Africanism. Sékou Touré was born in 1922, and he was the first president of Guinea-Conakry that attained its independence in 1958. To a greater extent, he contributed to the rise of PAM as seen below. He stressed the need to unite in democratic organizations, men and women irrespective of their differences. He condemned the racist policies of the French as undemocratic and invited Africans to oppose them. He advocated for the African unity and opposed the French balkanization fragmentation on the continent that brought the Africans together. He opposed the French Federation of bringing the French colonies under one administration, which would promote neocolonialism. He strongly supported the 1958 referendum in which Guinea-Conakry voted in note for her independence and has destroyed the French colonial bondage. He helped to create Ghana-Mali Union, and this was a gesture towards the integration of African countries. Africa and history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. Factors that delayed PAM to have impact on Africa before 1945. Pan-African conferences were held in Europe and in America, and Africans from the continent could not attend due to the restrictions from the whites. This limited the exposure of Pan-Africanism. PAM lacked support from the few independent African states, i.e. Ethiopia and Liberia. This is because these countries were facing internal problems, like Ethiopia between 1935 and 1941 when Italy invaded it, making PAM more theoretical than practical. PAM was originally a movement of intellectuals, i.e. W.E.B. Du Bois, George Padmore, William Sylvester in the diaspora. Therefore, the uneducated peasants were ignored. Their ideas were not represented, and this undermined the popularity of PAM in its initial stages. The widespread illiteracy and ignorance on the entire African continent greatly affected PAM by 1945. Africans were largely characterized by few people who would conceive the idea of PAM in its depth, and it became difficult to sensitize the masses about the alien foreign thing as they claimed. Lack of a propaganda base in Africa before 1945 accounts for the limited impact of PAM. There was no place where Africans would meet to discuss the affairs of their continent until Ghana became independent in 1957, and it provided a base for the movement. The poor infrastructural development in Africa was an inhibiting factor for PAM. Transport and communication were still very poor, underdeveloped, and this limited the scale of interaction and dissemination of information about PAM and its objectives. The negative influence of colonial powers in Africa greatly undermined the impact of The colonialists looked at PAM as sabotage to this day in Africa that would inspire self-rule. Therefore, this led to the arrest of several nationalists linked to PAM like Nkrumah, Lumumba, etc. Low levels of patriotism, particularly before World War II. It should be noted that many Africans succumbed to colonialism and feared to oppose it, hence this limited the operation of PAM in Africa, and this was left to the people in the diaspora. Language barrier also made the movement to have less impact on the African continent. Africans lacked a language which the common people would understand, as the founders used the language of their colonial masters, i.e. from Europe and America. Therefore, African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date, PAM. Ideological differences among the leading personalities of PAM affected its development. It is true that all the founders agreed on aims and objectives of PAM, but often disagreed on the methods to achieve the objectives. G.W.E.B. Du Bois was a moderate and believed in peace, advocated for the rights of slaves, whereas Marcus Garvey was a radical and preferred violence and use of force to achieve independence in Africa. This militated against the development of PAM. PAM before 1945 had been perceived as a brief movement aimed at promoting the interests of the blacks in the diaspora. The native Africans always looked at the movement as an organization of strangers who did not have the original African culture at heart, hence it was opposed in the early stages. The black descendants in the New World experienced financial constraints. They lacked adequate resources and workforce to spread the idea of Pan-Africanism. This explains why PAM and its activities remained on paper for a long time, as the resources were very limited to finance its development. The colonial policies in Africa introduced by the Europeans could not allow PAM to have a level ground. These policies divided Africans and groomed politicians who created hatred and bickering. This was very true in the British colonies, where divide and rule was practiced. The French and the Portuguese colonies were a assimilation policy that took a center stage, hence dividing Africans, not to unite. The native Africans of the time were politically backward and ignorant of the rights they were to enjoy. They treated whites as a godly race, and therefore it is not surprising that their consciousness took long to be aroused for consolidated unity. Challenges of PAM from 1945. The area of operation is too big, i.e. from the Caribbean and America, Europe, West Indies and Africa, hence this limited the effective operation of PAM. African societies lacked a fairly developed cash economy that would be used to finance the activities of PAM. The African societies therefore were weakened by the European colonial policies. Lack of militant nationalism on the African continent. This was only realized after World War II, i.e. by ex-servicemen and the emergence of intellectuals that attended the MC. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date, PAM. Lack of indigenous African political culture of purpose. The Africans were forced to adopt the Western political culture, like the multi-party politics and disguised democracy, which would not solve the African problems but only divided them. The heterogeneous nature of the Africans in terms of race, tribe, i.e. Africa has the blacks, coloreds, white and Indians. Also, so many languages are spoken on the African continent, and with a variety of religious views which can't foster the gospel of PAM. There was a problem of regionalism in Africa. Nkrumah and Nasser advocated for the integration of all Africans into the United States of Africa, as the pioneers of PAM proposed. Others, like Azikiwe of Nigeria, opposed this and considered smaller groupings, hence leading to smaller organizations, i.e. EEC, COMESA, SADC and ECOWAS. The impact of civil wars divided the African states and affected unity and cooperation, i.e. the 1967-1970 Biafra secession, 1960 Katanga secession divided Africans, as some countries in Africa were in support of the destruction of those countries. The interstate and personal rivalries in Africa have dragged down PAM. African leaders were seen supporting the subversive activities of the rebels in different countries, and cases in this category include Uganda and Rwanda, being accused of supporting the Nyamurenge to overthrow the government of Laurent Kabila. The weaknesses of OAU impacted negatively of PAM. OAU was never perfect since its inception. It was economically and politically weak. It had no army, etc. amidst ideological differences. The differences in the level of development among the Africans, stronger economies like Egypt, Ivory Coast and Nigeria were not willing to share their resources with the poor countries like Burundi, Uganda and Mozambique, which championed unity. Bad governance which surrounded the African continent. This was witnessed in the violation of human rights in Uganda under Idi Amin Dada, Mobutu Sese of Zaire. This was a reflection of colonial oppressive rule of the Europeans on the African continent, hence a challenge of PAM. Neocolonialism has further impacted negatively on PAM. The former colonial masters and the industrialized nations of the world have intensified their materials, and this has undermined development which can't bring about effective economic prosperity. Africa in history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date, PAM. The independent states have been divided along Anglophone and Francophone lines. These countries adopted foreign cultures as they have been made vulnerable to the dictates of their former foreign masters instead of addressing their local problems. Achievements of PAM. 1. Assess the contribution of PAM up to 1963. 2. To what extent has PAM fulfilled the aims and objectives of its founders? 3. Discuss the achievements of PAM since 1945. The PAM led to decolonization of the African continent. Ghana was decolonized in 1957 and other African countries followed, with South Africa being decolonized lastly in 1994, hence the movement gained independence for all African countries, and this was a great achievement. The activities of PAM made many Africans in the diaspora to return home from Europe and America. Marcus Garvey advocated for the Back to Africa as a slogan, and this forced many Africans to return. George Padmore became a citizen of Ghana, and other nationalists like Kamuzu Banda Malawi returned home. PAM created unity between Africans and Arabs. This solidarity and unity was showed when Nkrumah convened the Second Accra Conference in 1958. These united Africans and fastened the rate of decolonization on the African continent. It was through the activities of OAU, which was part of PAM, that Africa got the continental body in 1963. After ANC of 1945, Kwame Nkrumah became an active member of PAM and advocated for the United States of Africa. This came after the coalition of Monrovia and Casablanca forming a loose confederation that would solve the problems of colonialism. PAM achieved in holding several conferences that brought Africans together. It began with the MC Accra Conference of 1958 and 1960 Tunis Conference, and these discussed the way forward of the black people to achieve self-rule, hence an achievement. PAM led to development of regional integrations which brought Africans together. These African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM, challenges they faced. The setting up of these economic integrations was to bring Africans together and speed up the achievements of PAM developments. PAM intervened in the various conflicts on the African continent in order to reduce disunity. These included civil wars in Nigeria in 1967-1970, the Congo Civil War 1965, in Angola and Mozambique were all silenced by PAM's efforts. Therefore, stability was created on the African continent. PAM succeeded in producing the Africans who were Secretary-Generals at the UNO, and this included Boutros Ghali and Kofi Annan of Ghana. These Africans spoke vehemently in the same voice in international forums for the voice of the voiceless Africans, hence uplifting the dignity of the African race. It condemned the racist governments in Africa, more so in South Africa during the apartheid regime, the racist government of Ian Smith of South Rhodesia, and it also fought the atrocities of Don Salazar in Portuguese Africa. It condemned military coups and political assassinations in Africa. A case in point was President Olympio of Togo, who was assassinated in 1963, Patrice Lumumba assassinated in 1961 during the Katanga secession. The condemnation of political coups and assassinations was a great achievement of PAM. It defended and preserved African culture. African languages like Kiswahili, Zulu have been developed to enhance interaction and communication in Africa with a view of preserving the culture. Several books have been written and published in various languages. As a result of PAM, and the Bureau of African Languages was established in Kampala. PAM proposed the construction of Trans-African Highway Project. This was meant to develop and improve transport network in Africa. It was to start from Mombasa through Uganda, DRC, Cameroon to Nigeria. It was aimed at easing mobility and unifying people on top of improving trade. PAM promoted peace and stability in Africa, although the newly independent African states experienced civil wars and military coups. PAM tried to come up with workable solutions to end instabilities. A case in point was Angola, Mozambique, Chad and Sudan, which experienced civil wars. The movement fought neocolonialism and its negative impact on the Africans. This started African history. The Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM, were encouraged to decrease relationships with their colonial masters, and Nkrumah described this as the worst and the dangerous form of imperialism and appealed to the African states to fight it with all their strengths. PAM has stayed for a long period of time, and this is a great achievement. Its long stay is attributed to the strong state-togetherness among African leaders by evolving from a loose confederation of OAU to O, which is a major continental organization. Failures/weaknesses of PAM. PAM failed to completely end slavery in Africa. Countries like Sudan, Morocco, Chad, Mauritania have consistently practiced slavery, and this is a failure of PAM. Africans have not been accorded the respect and dignity they deserve in the world. Sectarianism and racism still exist on the continent. Blacks are not fully represented in games and sports. Africans' teams are considered inferior like their counterparts in Europe and America, which are regarded superior, and this difference brings Africans to be looked down. The movement failed to convince all the blacks to return to Africa from the diaspora. Many of these could not return because of the extreme poverty on the continent. Only those few who returned, like George Padmore, were to assess the performance of PAM but not stay in Africa. Hence the failure to bring back the people of the black origin was the failure of PAM failed to achieve total independence of the African continent, and this is manifested by the Western Sahara, which is still struggling to uproot the policies of Morocco from its politics. PAM was expected to fight for the independence of all Africans on the continent, and this failure to liberate Western Sahara is an indicator of a weak movement. The movement has not fully united the blacks and the Arabs on the continent. There is still a conflict between the blacks and Arabs of the north of Africa, as they look at themselves as being different races. The blacks associate Arabs with slavery, and this is a failure of the movement clearly seen in northern and south Sudan. PAM failed to achieve a common market and a single currency for the entire continent. This has made it difficult and has caused competition and protectionism. It has therefore African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date, PAM, failed to bring about a uniform currency that has made African countries to stagger and dwindle at the expense of stronger currency like dollars, euros, pounds, yen, etc. PAM has failed to end conflicts on the African continent. Africa is still a continent of restless conflicts like those that exist between Rwanda, Burundi, DRC, Uganda, Somalia, Ethiopia, etc. PAM has failed to end the military coups and assassinations on the African continent, i.e. President Talbot of Liberia was overthrown by Samuel Doe in 1980 with bloodshed. Laurent Kabila was killed, Gaddafi were killed, and this was a failure of the movement. It failed to stop cultural erosion. The Western culture is still preferred, and Africans were seriously copying the Western culture through the wave of globalization and promoting cultural alienation. PAM has done nothing to stop the ugly scenario of the dress code, including nudity, which opposes African culture. It failed to eradicate neocolonialism in all its forms like foreign aid, technological transfer, and education. This has made African countries to associate with their colonial masters and the Western world in general, hence losing their direct independence as colonialism came back through the back door. It has failed to eradicate poverty, ignorance, and diseases in Africa. Africa is regarded as one of the poorest continents in the world where people die of treatable diseases due to mass illiteracy. The movement has therefore failed to improve the welfare of the people on the continent. It has failed to create a continental language. The African continent up to date lacks a common language, and they speak English for the Anglophone states, French and Kiswahili was proposed to be a continental language, though it is restricted in Africa and spoken by a small percent of Africans. It has failed to stop human rights abuse in Africa. It is on record that Africa has the worst record of human rights abuse and violation due to existence of dictators in government who kept on killing, beating, and bundling opposition leaders upon arrest. It has failed to ensure infrastructural development on the African continent. Many of the African states have poor social-economic infrastructures, especially in the transport system. This has affected the mechanism of development in the areas of agriculture and African history. The Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. Algerian WAR of independence 1954–1962 QN 1. Account for the War of Independence in Algeria. 2. To what extent was France responsible for the Algerian War of Liberation between 19,541,962. 3. Account for the delayed independence of Algeria. 4. Examine the role played by National Liberation Front FL and towards the independence of Algeria. 5. Examine the consequences of the 1954–1962 Algerian Revolution. Causes. Algeria is found in the Maghreb region, dominated largely by Arabs and Kabyle speakers. It was colonized by France in 1830. In November 1954, a liberation war led by Ahmed Ben Bella, Belkacem Krim, Farhat Abbas, Miss Ali Haj under the FLN umbrella started war against the French colonial rule and raged on until 1962. 1. Desire for independence caused the Algerian War of Liberation. The Algerians were under the French from 1830 to 1962, 132 years, and were therefore tired of foreign, oppressive, and exploitative rule. 2. The rise of Algerian nationalists, e.g. Farhat Abbas, Masali, Haji, Aouri, Bamidien, then Bella, etc. led to the independence struggle. These formed Friends of the Manifesto of Liberty, which organized the Sétif demonstration of 1945. Then Bella and other young radicals formed the organization Secret Zero, as to fight against the French also formed FLN. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. 4. The people of Algeria wanted their liberty and freedom observed. The French were oppressive to the extent that freedom was a rare commodity. There was no freedom of press, expression, assembly, and anybody who tried to assert his freedom was dumped in prison. Therefore, Algerians emerged on the war stage to claim their rights and liberties. 5. Influence of Cold War politics caused the Algerian War of Independence. The Communist bloc fully supported the Algerian War of Independence, providing military logistics, economic assistance, moral backing, and financial aid to FLN to dispose off the capitalist bands. 6. Impact of World War II caused a war of independence in Algeria. It equipped Algerians with military tactics skills, and it was an eye-opener against colonialism. E.g. Ben Bella, a leading nationalist in Algeria, participated in World War II on the side of France and acquired military experience that he used to wage a war against France in Algeria. 7. Declaration of Algeria as an overseas province of France caused a war of independence. In 1951, France declared Algeria as her metropolitan/overseas province despite geographical differences. This meant that whatever happened, Algeria would never be independent because it was part and parcel of France. This was unacceptable to the Algerians, they preferred to be treated as a colony which would have a right to demand for their autonomy. 8. Impact of the VE Day celebrations of 1945 resulted into the independence struggle in Algeria. On 8 May 1945, Algerians were celebrating their victory in Europe and used the celebrations to demand for Algeria's independence. They moved with banners chanting, "Long live free Algeria, down with French colonialism." This did not please the African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today. PAM. 10. The influence of the American troops in Morocco inspired the War of Independence in Algeria. The Americans in Morocco convinced the conservative sultan to demand for Morocco's independence from the French and caused viable changes in the country. This inspired the Algerian to demand for similar changes against the French in Algeria. The colonization/twin independence of Morocco and Tunisia in 1956. 11. Success of the 1952 Egyptian Revolution caused the independence struggle in Algeria. Egypt under Nasser was against foreign colonial rule. She funded the activities of Algerian nationalists against the French colonial rule. Algerian nationalists were given asylum in Cairo, gave military training, arms, etc. in order to root out colonial rule from Algeria. 12. Influence of the Vietnamese War of Independence against the French caused the War of Independence in Algeria. The Vietnamese began the independence struggle in 1946-1954 with the Viet Cong under the Chi Minh and defeated the French at the famous Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Therefore, Ben Bella witnessed the defeat in the Vietnamese War and concluded that the Algerian would defeat the French, and the Algerian did, hence forming FLN in 1954 Cairo to dislodge the French. 13. Influx of white settlers into Algeria caused the War of Independence. France encouraged poor and elderly whites from Malta, Spain, Corsica to settle in Algeria and put pressure on Algerian resources. By 1954 there were over 1 million white settlers. They enjoyed urban life, employment, took African land, etc., which did not please the Algerian nationalists. 14. The independence of Syria and Lebanon from French imperialism inspired the Algerians to fight for their own independence. They reasoned that if their fellow Arab countries could get independence, they why not the Arab Algerians, hence the war being inevitable. 15. The imposition of the French culture onto the Algerians caused the Liberation War. French imposed the French language onto the Algerians and undermined Arabic. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today. PAM. 16. Religious differences between the Arab Muslims and the Catholic French colonialists caused the Liberation War in Algeria. The French forced Algerians to convert to the Catholic faith and abandon Islamic practices. The Quran was replaced by the Bible, mosques were turned into churches, and Islamic names were substituted with Christian names. The Arab Muslims in Algeria hated being ruled by infidels Catholic and were annoyed by the French. This compelled the Algerians to stage the War of Independence. 17. Racial discrimination against the Algerians caused the Liberation War. The French practiced discriminatory measures in employment and promotion, favouring majority of the white settlers, e.g. Ferhat Abbas, which rekindled the opposition to French colonialism. Got discontented with the discrimination he experienced in the promotion in the French army. Besides, the Arabs were pushed to the countryside and urban life was monopolized by the white race. 18. Overtaxation of the Algerian resulted into the War of Independence in Algeria. In order to sustain the ever-growing white population, heavy multiple taxes were imposed on Algerian natives. The method of tax collection simply dehumanized the taxpayers. It often involved public flogging of suspected tax defaulters. Those who failed to pay were often dumped in jail. The heavy taxes worsened poverty among the local people, thus misery was a common feature among the natives. 19. Forced labor/exploitation of peasants caused the Algerian War of Independence. The colonialists subjected Africans to forced labor. Africans worked without pay on public projects. They were harshly supervised. Many times the Africans fainted/suffocated in the process of working on private and public projects of colonialists. This paved way for the War of Independence. 20. Land alienation caused the War of Independence in Algeria. From 1830, when the French occupied Algeria, there was an influx of poor whites into Algeria. The white settlers monopolized the agricultural land and mineral resources, especially in the Constantine. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today. PAM. Under representation of Algerians in the National Assembly. Influence of the writings of Fanon France, for example, the black skin, white masks, the dying colonialism. He was a medical doctor by qualification and criticized the French system. Effects of the Algerian Revolution positive. 1. Stepped up Algerian nationalism. The Algerians were able to come together and rescue their country from foreign hegemony/domination. 2. Led to the Algerian independence in 1962. This ended the French colonial rule that had lasted for 132 years, and Ben Bella became the first president. 3. Ushered in agrarian reforms in Algeria. After the French settlers had vacated, many people gained access to land and increased agricultural production. 4. It had to the second coming of Charles de Gaulle to power in France in 1958. De Gaulle was able to overthrow the Fourth Republic of Radomir, who had failed to settle the Algerian question. 5. Popularized the FLN internationally. It received support from the communist bloc. It was recognized by the UN. Egypt greatly backed FLN. 6. Forced France to grant independence to Tunisia and Morocco in 1956 and all the French colonies south of the Sahara. 7. Promoted unity in Algeria. This unity was mainly enhanced by the radio, which mobilized the people to come together and resist the common enemy. The Algerians used the war period to heal old wounds of enmity. The Arab and Kabyle speakers were able to reconcile. Voice of Algeria. It resulted into the revival of Algerian culture. Arabic speaking was recognized. Islam was once again a dignified religion. All Arabic practices and Islamic practices were given due regard. 9. Compel Britain and Belgium to speed up the decolonization of their territories in Africa, e.g. Ghana, Nigeria, Congo, for fear of a possible war. 10. Resulted into the introduction of democracy in Algeria. From 1962, when Ben Bella was elected the first African president, universal adult suffrage came into effect. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. 11. It increased women participation in politics. The women worked as war combatants, spies, recruitment agents, smugglers of war weapons. After the war, the women gained significance in the civil service, army, and politics. 12. Led to the adoption of socialism in Algeria. This was partly because Algeria received a lot of support from the socialist countries during the independence struggle. She was able to get economic, political, and social aid to rehabilitate the economy, e.g. from USSR, China, etc. 13. Algeria assumed an active part of Pan-Africanism and labored so much to help African countries that were still under colonial rule, e.g. Western Sahara, Guinea-Conakry. 14. Led to industrialization in Algeria through increased petroleum mining using Cuban resources, products like electrical appliances, and this improved the standard of living. 15. Led to the formation of the Maghreb Union, i.e. unity of Arab African countries in North Africa. 16. Led to release of political prisoners, Ben Bella, Farhad Abbas among others. 17. Led to formation of cooperative societies. Negative effects. Led to the death of both soldiers and civilians. Nearly 1 million Algerians, mainly of the Islamic faith, perished in the war. Led to massive destruction of properties, especially in 1958 when the French used their planes to destroy villages, a Scotch policy of being non-selective. Algerians didn't defeat the French and thus lost political prestige. Led to displacement of people, thus causing refugees crisis. 2 million were displaced from their villages. 1 million white settlers were uprooted from Algeria. Led to creation of concentration camps where Africans were congested for effective monitoring by the French. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. It ushered in the dictatorship of Ben Bella. This invited the military to overthrow him in a coup in 1965 led by Houari Boumediene. Led to the Suez Canal crisis of 1956 in Egypt. This was because Nasser funded the liberation struggle in Algeria, thus antagonizing the French. Led to massive economic crisis in France. The economy experienced a slump, forcing the army officers to ally with Charles de Gaulle to overthrow the Fourth Republic Radomir in 1958. Led to rise of Islamic fundamentalism. Terrorist groups emerged, resulting into a civil war in Algeria, causing instability in the Middle East, supporting PLO terrorist attacks on Israel, and turned the Middle East into a blood-stained region as Jews and Palestinians continued to kill one another. Reasons for the success of the Algerian War of Independence. Role played by the National Liberation Front (FLN). It was formed in 1954 by Ahmed Ben Bella while in exile in Cairo and declared war against the French colonial rule, and the roles include the following. It groomed leaders who fought and sustained the war against the French, e.g. Houari Boumediene, Bad Africa, Chadri, etc. It tried to pursue peaceful means of struggle with the French for Algeria's independence, e.g. dialogues, demonstrations, petitions, non-cooperation. Resorted to armed struggle against French colonial rule in 1954 and sustained the war up to 1962. This weakened the French imperial will. It sought for support and recognition from the communist bloc, i.e. from USSR, providing military assistance, diplomatic support, moral courage. FLN called for the release of political prisoners, e.g. Ben Bella, to further their nationalistic agenda. FLN sought support and recognition of United Nations, indeed the UN acknowledged FLN's contribution and condemned the French subversions in Algeria. FLN involved women in the struggle for independence. The women were used as spies. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. FLN established an exile-based government known as Chipra in Cairo. This helped to groom all leaders and coordinated the activities of freedom fighters in Algerian Revolutionary People's Government. FLN established external bases in Morocco, Tunisia and Egypt. Such bases were used for training, recollection and based in such areas to attack the French colonial government. FLN openly criticized and exposed the evils of the French colonial rule, e.g. killing of innocent people, detention without trial, overtaxation, etc., making the public and the international community to react. FLN established political and economic reforms in all liberated areas, e.g. grassroots democracy, agricultural reforms, rule of law, etc., which made Algerians value the cause for independence. It established a propaganda base to propagate anti-colonial messages, i.e. set up Free Voice of Algeria, which mobilized and sensitized the public of resist French colonial rule. FLN forged unity among Algerians, i.e. the Arabic speakers and the Kabyle speakers. The whole country was bound together to resist a common enemy for the sake of Algerians' independence. In 1962, the French granted Algerian independence following the talks in a referendum which FLN represented the Algerians. The contribution of Algerian nationalists led to the end of French colonial rule. For example, Ben Bella, Aouri Boumediene, Belkis and Krim, etc., they fought the French, involved in dialogue, participated in the 1962 referendum, recruited freedom fighters, solicited for external support, called for unity during the struggle for independence, formed African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. Dialogue with FLN and organized a referendum which FLN swept with 99.7% in favor of independence. Support from the communist bloc favored the independence of Algeria. It provided financial and military aid to FLN and extended moral support to freedom fighters, which inspired them to fight with vigor for independence. Support given to Algerians by the Arab League/Arab states led to the success of the independence struggle. These countries used Tunisia to channel financial and military aid to FLN. Anti-war mood in France led to the success of the independence struggle in Algeria. French youth who supported de Gaulle's resolves to grant independence to Algeria later turned to demonstrations in Rouen, Toulon and Venice. They were supported by the veterans of the Vietnamese War of Independence, and they were not ready to continue fighting overseas wars. Tunisia's independence in 1956 favored the liberation of Algeria. The Algerian freedom fighters grouped in safe havens provided by the Tunisians and always returned to attack. Tunisia also provided training grounds to the FLN freedom fighters. The role played by the international community led to the success of the independence struggle by Algeria. After the French bombardment of Saqqet, Sidi Yazef in 1958, America exerted strong diplomatic pressure on France to respect the demands of Algerians. In response, France began negotiations with FLN, which resulted into Algerians' independence on 5 July 1962. The role played by the General Union of Algerian Workers led the success of the independence struggle. It organized support for FLN in Algiers among workers, organized demonstrations and strikes which helped to depopularize the French rule and added weight. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. Smuggled revolvers, grenades, hundreds of false identity cards, bombs and millions of francs to buy medicine and supplies for the guerrillas. The resort to armed struggle/violence led to the success of the War of Liberation in Algeria. In 1954, the Algerians resorted to armed struggle, having realized that peaceful methods had failed. The war option broke the back of the French colonial rule, thus the independence of Algeria. The counter-revolutionary warfare of the French made the independence struggle a success. The French resorted to mass arrests of suspects, destruction of villages and collective punishments, brutal interrogation. This made the masses determined and rally behind FLN to fight and defeat the French. Popular support given to the independence struggle led to the success of the Algerian Liberation War. The public fully supported this struggle, and by 1962 FLN forces numbered 200,000 troops. Role played by Nkrumah against the French state colonial rule in the back. Nkrumah strongly opposed the French nuclear tests that were being carried out at Regan in Algeria. When the French continued with the nuclear tests, he froze French economic assets in Ghana until they agreed to negotiate for independence. He sent off the French ambassador from Accra and recalled the Ghanaian ambassador in Paris. This affected France economically and internationally, tarnished her image Islamic factor. Writers like Frantz Fanon, strong determination of Algerians. The 1965 Algerian Revolution coup QNS. 1. Account for the 1965 military coup in Algeria. 2. Examine the causes and effects of 1965 military takeover of Algeria. 3. To what extent was Ben Bella responsible for his own overthrow in 1965? 4. How far were economic factors responsible for 1965 Algerian Revolution? In 1965, the government of Ahmed Ben Bella was overthrown by Aouri Boumediene in a military coup. This was due to Ben Bella became a dictator and could not be tolerated anymore. He hated all positive criticism directed towards his government. He became final in all state decisions. The African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. Opposition was steadily suppressed and voices of the majority were shunned. This caused the overthrow of Ben Bella. Transformation of Algeria into a one-party system caused the overthrow of Ben Bella. He only allowed FLN political space. Emerging political parties were suppressed in their infancy. Failure to fulfill promises made at mass rallies caused the downfall of Ben Bella. He became a great speaker with brilliant promises and fulfilled none of them, e.g. promised rapid development, employment, land redistribution, etc. But 1965 nothing had come to fulfillment. 1965. Insufficiency of social economic facilities, especially in Algiers, caused the coup. Power supply, water, etc. became very scarce and life for the average Algerian proved hard. Low levels of education and experience of state workers caused the overthrow of Ben Bella. He was accused for failing to rapidly improve education facilities and taking Algerians for further training to fight inefficiency in the economy. Unemployment, which led to the brain drain, led to the overthrow of Ben Bella. 70,000 elites moved out of Algeria to seek for employment, especially France, leaving behind a manpower crisis. The economy was run down. High levels of poverty among the Algerian peasantry caused the downfall of Ben Bella. The Algerian economy was characterized by inefficiency despite of increased productivity. This resulted into low prices for people's produce, making poverty loom large among the peasant. Lack of economic progress despite the increased prices of oil. The proceeds were plundered by the ministers and the president. Divisions in the army caused the downfall of Ben Bella. Ben Bella had a proposal to form a people's militia and ran down the national army. This did not please the army officers who had just liberated the country from French colonial rule. Personal rivalry between Ben Bella and Boumediene caused the military coup of 1965. Ben Bella had spent a lot of time in prison during the liberation struggle and only released in 1962 to become a leader. Therefore, Boumediene did not appreciate Ben Bella as a national leader. Ben Bella was planning to reshuffle Boumediene as the army commander. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. Breakdown of the economy caused trouble for Ben Bella. As workers took over factories and shared profits after paying a contribution for the state, they mismanaged economic affairs of the country. Production sectors were paralyzed. Failure of Ben Bella's socialist reforms led to the overthrowing of his government, e.g. he nationalized major means of production, e.g. industries, banks, large private enterprises, etc., and in the event antagonized capital owners. These teamed up with army officers to oust the government of Ben Bella. Corruption and inefficiency in the government of Ben Bella caused his overthrow. Then, Bella failed to control misuse of public funds by his ministers, permanent secretaries and army officers, and accumulated wealth within a short time. The civil war that broke out in the Kabylie region caused the overthrow of Ben Bella. Many people who had fought in the liberation war remained with guns and kept on killing, robbing, looting, and terrorizing the capital city and the countryside. This was blamed on Ben Bella, causing his downfall. Power lost by Colonel Lauri Boumediene resulted into the overthrow of Bella. Boumediene had played a central role in the liberation war against the French, and therefore he wanted to assume the supreme office. Then Bella abused the press/censorship of the press, only wanted the mass media to report positively about his government. Press freedom was greatly limited to the disappointment of liberal army officers. Influence of successful coups caused the overthrow of Ben Bella. Successful coups such as 1963 coup in Togo, 1965 in Congo, 1952 coup in Egypt inspired coup plotters in Algeria to topple Ben Bella. Rise of Islamic fundamentalism in Algeria created enmity for Ben Bella. These preached the teachings of Islam where a leader must be accountable to the subjects. Thefts led to restoration of collective leadership in Algeria. An economic restoration program was launched in 1968, 3 years industrial plan which resulted into development of several industries. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. Agrarian revolution was launched in 1971, enabling Algerians to access land for production. There was expansion of free education, health services, and other social amenities to improve the welfare of Algerians. Algeria supported non-alignment movement and thus tried to pursue a neutral policy in international politics. Promoted democracy in 1965-68 by electing leaders from the grassroots. Algeria turned to the socialist bloc, receiving a lot of support from socialist countries like USSR, China, Cuba, among others. Oil revenue increased resulting from proper use of the oil reserve. Algeria trained local manpower to man industries, and by Algeria's industrial sector was experiencing a boom. Algeria started supporting liberation movements, e.g. Polisario in Western Sahara. Tried to fight desertification to reforestation programs. Tried to fight corruption by bringing corrupt officials to book. Algeria became an active member of the Maghreb Union, i.e. Union of Tunisia, Morocco, Libya, i.e. majorly Arab countries in North Africa. Negative. Failed to maintain good relationship with neighbors, e.g. Morocco. Algeria funded terrorist groups that threatened peace in the Maghreb region. Boumediene became a dictator and suppressed the opposition. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. Nationalism in Portuguese Africa, the rough road to independence and the liberation wars. Portugal was the earliest colonial master in Africa, and it was the last to vacate the continent. The Portuguese colonies included Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, Sao Tome and Principe. NB, the Portuguese used very autocratic, coercive and regressive methods to administer the colonies, and this greatly delayed the independence of the Africans. The Africans therefore resorted to armed struggle to claim their rapid independence. Factors that delayed independence in the Portuguese colonies. 1. The Portuguese regarded their colonies as overseas territories, leading to delayed independence. The Portuguese leader Dom Salazar smuggled this issue into the Portuguese constitution, and it became illegal and difficult to grant independence without amending the constitution. 2. The existence of a tight and strong spy network in the colonies delayed independence. Portugal had a repressive police called PAI that crashed African struggles. The PAI police arrested, detained, and assassinated African leaders. It is on record that Eduardo Mondlane of Mozambique was assassinated in 1968 and Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau in 1973. This affected Africans' clear road to independence. 3. The military superiority of the Portuguese contributed to the delayed independence of African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. 5. The support received by Portugal from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO hindered the independence of Portuguese colonies. The NATO forces came to check the spread of communism that gave support to the liberation movements, for example, Emplot in Angola, Frelimo in Mozambique, and PIC in Guinea-Bissau. The military and financial support of NATO weakened the Africans. 6. Limited exposure to nationalistic ideas among the Africans delayed independence struggles. It is true that Africans were denied external contacts and interactions. Banning of liberal press reports and literature were all a stumbling block. The Portuguese accessed African mails and telegrams, hence delaying independence. 7. Lack of constitutional avenues to attain independence hindered early decolonization. Africans were denied participation in political affairs, were not represented in the parliament, and all political activism was restricted. 8. The conservative rule of Dr. Dom Salazar 1928-68 delayed the independence of Portuguese colonies. Dom Salazar was very repressive and not prepared to grant independence. He was opposed to liberal ideas, and he remarked thus, "I cannot bend the winds of change." This broke the hopes of the Africans not to get early independence. 9. The ruthless policies of the Portuguese administrators also delayed the independence of the Portuguese colonies, suppressed the African programs, strikes. About 49 dock workers were shot dead in Mozambique, 50 in Guinea-Bissau, and 200 in Angola. Leaders like Agostinho Neto were arrested and publicly flogged, hence discouraging Africans' activities. 10. The establishment of rehabilitation centers, reserve camp. These camps housed suspects who were tortured and killed. Examples of these camps were in Zambezi Valley, fortified. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. 12. The economic advantage of African colonies to Portugal delayed independence. The independence of Africans could weaken the economy of Portugal. The existence of Portugal in Africa had guaranteed her middlemanship position in Europe and could not therefore let the colonies get independence. 13. The economic dwarfness of Portugal delayed the independence of Portuguese colonies. Portugal was very poor and could not sustain its economy without the financial support of African territories. This therefore delayed independence. 14. The high literacy rate among the Africans delayed the independence. It should be noted that the Portuguese deliberately offered inferior education, and the education did not offer technical skills to Africans and intellectual abilities. This therefore limited the scope of nationalistic movements, hence delaying independence. 15. The divide and rule policy of the Portuguese affected nationalistic sentiments among Africans. National unity of purpose was destroyed by the Portuguese of the Ovambundu against the Bakongo in Angola, the Fula and the Balonte in Guinea-Bissau, and the Makiut Nyani against the Makonde in Mozambique. This retarded early independence struggles. 16. Existence of ethnic nationalism, micronationalism affected the independence of Portuguese colonies. The Bakongo, Mbundu and Ovambundi in Angola were not united. The Fula and Balonte in Guinea-Bissau never cooperated, and the Nyanya, Makiut and Makonde in Mozambique were also grumbling. The failure to diffuse ethnicity delayed the independence of Portuguese colonies. 17. The apathy that existed among Africans delayed independence. Some Africans were not interested in the calls for independence and could not join the liberation struggles. Others used peaceful means to demand for independence, yet colonial masters understood the language of violence. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. Emploi operated in Congo Zaire and Congo Brazzaville. PAIC operated in French Guinea. This made them to have slim impact on the Portuguese stay in Africa. 20. The weaknesses of the Organization of African Unity OAU affected nationalism in Portuguese Africa. OAU had established a liberation committee based in Tanzania, but it made more condemnation and its contribution remained theoretical due to limited funds and military incapacitations. 21. The double standards of the United Nations Organization frustrated the efforts of Africans in Portuguese colonies. The UN verbally reacted and imposed weak sanctions on the Portuguese. Some members of the UN also doubled as members of NATO that gave support to the capitalist Don Salazar. This left the Africans more disappointed. 22. The formation of the Triumvirate Alliance strengthened the Portuguese administration in Africa. This was a repressive movement or a gang of the three dictators, i.e. Don Salazar of Portugal, Verwoerd of South Africa and Ian Smith of the UDI of Southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. These pledged effective assistance to each other in case of war and resistance and suppressed Africans. 23. The ideological differences of the African leaders affected early independence. A case in point was Simango in Mozambique, who disagreed with Mondlane and joined the Portuguese, leading to the assassination of 1968 Emploi against unity of the capitalists. All these left Africans stumbling. 24. The negative attitude of the Catholic Church hindered early independence. The Catholic Church condemned the African liberation movement as terrorist clubs. They used their spiritual platform to scare away thousands of Africans, contributing to the delayed independence. Reference questions. African history. The Pan-African movement since 1900 today. PAM. Causes of the liberation struggles in Portuguese colonies. The Africans in the Portuguese colonies tried to use peaceful means in the initial stages. However, independence was far from reach and they resorted to armed struggle against the Portuguese. The people of Angola formed Emploi in 1956, launched war against the Portuguese in 1961. 1975 led by Agostinho Neto. The nationalists in Guinea-Bissau formed PAIC in 1954 by Amilcar Cabral. The war began in 1963-1974. The people in Mozambique formed Frelimo in 1962 under the leadership of Eduardo Mondlane and Simango. The war began in 1964-1975. The Portuguese regarded the colonies as overseas provinces, which sparked off the wars. This idea was declared in the 1951 Constitution of Portugal, and this negated African feelings. The Africans applied violence to break the colonial bondage. The brutality of the Portuguese led to the outbreak of the Liberation Wars. The Portuguese killed over 200,000 Angolans, others were terribly wounded and public flogging, e.g. Agostinho Neto. Dock workers were killed in Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau and others killed in strikes. All these sparked off armed struggle for independence. See lack of constitutional means to achieve independence forced Africans to declare war on the Portuguese. Africans in Angola, Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau were denied political participation in parliamentary structures. This compelled Africans to resort to the Liberation War. The dictatorial policies of the Portuguese led to the wars of independence. The Portuguese suppressed the freedoms of people in Angola, Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau. The press was censored and political parties were banned. These undemocratic activities pushed the Africans to resort to violent approaches. The tight spy network exposed by the Portuguese police power contributed to the war. African history. The Pan-African movement since 1900 today. PAM, respectively. This made Africans also to reciprocate by forming strong armies to engage the Portuguese. The establishment of concentration camps by the Portuguese occasioned the wars. These centers were set up to contain African resistances and to deny them access to foreign assistance. Africans were tortured and others assassinated in these centers, hence raising concern leading to the wars. The formation of the liberation movements by Africans in Portuguese Africa led to the armed struggles. PAIC was formed in 1954 in Guinea-Bissau, Emploi in 1956 in Angola, and Frelimo in 1962 in Mozambique. These organized the masses, united the people and declared guerrilla war against the Portuguese. The desire for political independence occasioned the liberation wars. Africans developed great nationalistic sentiments that pushed them into the war. This was because of the long period of political denial, hence making the war inevitable. The influence of the Marxist ideology, socialism in Portuguese Africa caused the wars. This ideology called for a classless society, was against imperialism and advocated for the use of militarism against foreign domination. The communist states therefore offered support to Africans to fight the Portuguese. The influence of the independent neighbouring states also contributed to the wars in Portuguese Africa. Countries like Congo Zaire, Congo Brazzaville, Guinea-Conakry, Senegal, Tanzania and Malawi inspired the Portuguese colonies to raise their morale for independence. The neighbouring states provided the logistical support, i.e. financial, military and external bases for the wars. All the role of the nationalistic leaders caused the wars. These included Augustin Neto, Angola, Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau and Eduardo Mondlane in Mozambique. These African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today PAM, and the unfair and heavy taxation imposed on the Africans caused the liberation wars. The methods of taxation were very cruel and harsh. The defaulters were arrested and flogged in public, hence sending Africans into a war mood. Our high levels of looming poverty among the Africans caused the war. Africans became poverty-stricken due to lack of employment, low prices of agricultural produce and low wages compared to the Portuguese workers. The impoverished Africans became disgruntled to open up war against the Portuguese. The corruption of the Portuguese administrators also caused the liberation wars. The officials were too corrupt in the collection of taxes and provision of the civil services. Bribes were at the highest levels. This provoked militant nationalism in Portuguese Africa. Huge lack of employment opportunities among the Africans contributed to the occurrence of the wars. All the existing jobs, including driving, office clerks and messengers, were preserved of the white minority. Africans were meant to offer forced labour on the plantations with meagre pay. This attracted resentment in all the Portuguese colonies, leading to war. All the inferior education system provided by the Portuguese made the wars inevitable. The education system given to Africans were not technical and intellectual to compete with. Portuguese Africans attended separate schools of missionaries established in rural areas. This laid a foundation for the liberation wars. As the racial arrogance of the Portuguese caused the liberation wars. This was packaged in the assimilation policy that forced Africans to take on their culture in totality. This policy produced a class of assimilados who accepted to drop African cultural values and were favoured at the expense of the indigenous Africans who refused to change. This created a situation of a war mood. The forced cash crop growing among Africans contributed to the liberation wars. The African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date, PAM, in the area and also dumped their goods which they charged expensively. This compelled Africans to launch war against the Portuguese colonial masters. The land alienation policy by the Portuguese caused the liberation wars. The Portuguese steadily grabbed land from Africans and established plantations. This left Africans landless and were sent to reserves, and others remained squatters on the white estates. The wars were staged in order to regain the lost land in an armed struggle. Reference questions. 1. Account for the outbreak of the Liberation War in Guinea-Bissau/Angola/Mozambique. 2. Discuss the factors for the armed resistance/militant nationalism in Portuguese colonies. 3. Why did the PAIC/Frelimo/MPLA declare war against the Portuguese rule in 1963/1964/1961 respectively? 4. The Portuguese maladministration was primarily responsible for the outbreak of the Liberation Wars. Discuss factors for the success of the liberation struggle in Portuguese Africa. These included the following. 1. The formation of liberation movements against the Portuguese led to the independence of these countries. These movements included PAIC, set up in 1954, MPLA in 1956, and Frelimo, established in 1962. They resorted to use of military approach against the Portuguese, leading to their eventual independence. 2. The effective military strategies adopted by the liberation movements led to the success of Africans. The liberation movements always attacked the Portuguese simultaneously in several places. They used surprise attacks and ambushes which weakened the Portuguese. 3. The liberation movements carried out mass mobilization and recruitment. Thousands of Africans joined the struggle. The massive recruitment strengthened the African struggles too. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. 5. The military gains scored by the liberation movements favoured independence in Portuguese Africa. The liberation movements of PAIC, Frelimo and MPLA gained almost a third of their respective countries by the occurrence of the Lisbon Coup of 1974. Such a situation weakened the Portuguese to grant independence. 6. The reforms instituted by the liberation movements in their respective territories enabled the success of the wars. The movements established liberated zones where the masses were involved in decision-making and grassroots leadership. The movements established elementary schools to provide free education, and health centres were set up which won the support of the masses. 7. The continuous repressive methods of the Portuguese hardened the Africans and raised the impetus for independence. Concentration camps were set up to bundle Africans, African homes and gardens were destroyed, nationalists were tortured and killed. All these undermined the popularity of the Portuguese. 8. The formation of the Comte Alliance by the liberation movement strengthened the African struggles. This was a composition of MPLA, PAIC and Frelimo. A combination of the liberation movements cooperated and shared ideas to weaken the Portuguese rule in Africa. 9. The simultaneous occurrence of liberation wars contributed to the success of African struggles. The Angolan War began in 1961, the war in Guinea-Bissau began in 1963, and the war in Mozambique started in 1964. These wars drained Portugal financially and militarily, leading to the success of the African struggles. 10. The withdrawal of native forces from the Portuguese colonies weakened the colonial administration. Portugal could no longer get financial and military assistance which had kept us strong against Africans, hence making Africans succeed. 11. The Lisbon coup of 1974 was a death blow to the Portuguese leadership in Africa. The coup. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. 13. The independence of the neighbouring states influenced the success of the liberation wars. These included Guinea-Conakry that assisted PAC of Guinea-Bissau, Congo-Brazzaville and Congo-Zaire supported MPLA of Angola, while Tanzania and Zambia supported FRELIMO, leading to the success of liberation movements. 14. The consolidated unity exhibited by the African liberation fighters contributed to the success of the wars. The Africans in Angola, Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau diffused ethnic rivalries and worked towards national unity. This weakened the Portuguese stay in Africa, leading to independence. 15. The favourable geographical settings were an advantage to the Africans in Portuguese Africa. Guinea-Bissau was covered with mangrove forest and thick bamboo forests. Mozambique had a thick forest cover near Niassa and Antete. Angola was advantaged with the coastline. All these favoured the movement of the Africans and were a disadvantage to the Portuguese. 16. The role of the Organisation of African Unity (OAU) enabled the attainment of Portuguese in Africa. From the formation of OAU in 1963, set up a liberation committee whose pivotal role was to grant independence to the colonised African countries. The organisation gave military and financial support to PAC, FRELIMO and MPLA, and also put sanctions against Portugal to decolonise. 17. The contribution of United Nations Organization UNO led to the success of the liberation wars. The UNO used the Security Council to condemn colonialism in Africa, impose both economic and political sanctions against the Portuguese, and also threatened to throw out Portugal from General Assemblies for its failure to decolonize. This yielded positively for the African. 18. The support from the communist world enabled the success of African independence in Portuguese Africa. The communist support came from China, USSR and Cuba. These countries gave military, logistical and financial advice which weakened the Portuguese in African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. The independence struggle in Angola 1960–1974. Reference questions. 1. The MPLA was primarily responsible for the decolonization of Angola. Discuss. 2. Examine contribution of Agostinho Neto in the liberation struggle of Angola. 3. Account for the success of the liberation war in Angola. MPLA was formed in 1956 by Elidio Tom Machado as the first president and later Agostinho Neto, who took over in 1958. Other liberation movements in Angola included National Union for the Total Independence of Angola UNITA, the National Front for the Liberation of Angola FNLA. It should be noted that MPLA played a significant role in the liberation of Angola in the following ways. The movement provided the necessary leadership against the Portuguese rule in Angola. Agostinho Neto, at the top of leadership, was very courageous, had a clear vision leading to the independence of Angola. MPLA diffused the ethnicity in Angola. It united the Mbundu, Ovembundu and Bakongo, contributing to independence. The MPLA established external bases in neighbouring countries of Congo-Zaire, Congo, Brazzaville, Zambia and Namibia. The movement therefore used these bases to launch attack against the Portuguese. The MPLA was able to unite and coordinate the political and military wings. This led to the commitment during the struggle for independence. MPLA appealed to the UNO for support. The UN reciprocated by giving financial and military support and imposed sanctions on the Portuguese, leading to independence. The MPLA won the recognition of the OAU. The OAU gave financial and military support using its Liberation Committee to weaken the Portuguese rule. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. MPLA cooperated with PIC and FRELIMO to form Campo Alliance. This alliance laid strategies against the Portuguese colonial masters. MPLA established liberated zones in Angola which led to reforms, e.g. free education, health centres. This attracted the attention and support of the local people, leading to independence. The MPLA recruited and trained Angolans in guerrilla warfare. The recruits increased activities of sabotage against the Portuguese programs and strategies. The movements enrolled women in the struggle for independence. The women worked as nurses, cooks and spies to the freedom fighters. This encouraged the liberation fighters to succeed. The MPLA organized and launched successful guerrilla warfare against the Portuguese by 1963. The movement scored military gains of the largest part of the country, contributing to the success of the war. The MPLA sensitized the masses of Angola on the evils of the Portuguese administration and benefits of the independence, leading to the success of the war. The MPLA received instruments of power from the Portuguese in 1975 under Agostinho Neto as chief. The MPLA negotiated with the new socialist government in Portugal under Antonio de Spinola. This yielded positive results leading to independence in 1975. Other factors for the success of Angolan Liberation War. The continuous repressive methods of the Portuguese hardened the Africans and increased their determination for independence. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. The collapse of the Triumvirate Alliance of Portugal, South Africa and Southern Rhodesia, which had strengthened the Portuguese rule in Africa. The independence of neighbouring countries like Tanzania and Zambia for Mozambique, Congo and Zambia for Angola, Senegal and Guinea-Conakry for Guinea-Bissau. The favourable geographical settings. Mozambique had a thick forest covering in Nyasa and Enteat swamps, while Angola had thick forests and swamps. Reference questions. 1. Examine the role of Agostinho Neto in the struggle for Angolan independence. 2. To what extent did Agostinho Neto contribute to the decolonization of Angola? Preamble. Agostinho Neto was born in 1922 to a Methodist priest in Bengo, a small village in rural Angola. He was a graduate of medicine in the University of Lisbon and joined the ranks of MPLA in 1958. Dr. Neto played a great role in the liberation of Angola in the following ways. Neto provided able and charismatic leadership during the liberation struggles. His character was composed of courage, vision and dedication, hence winning the independence of Angola. Agostinho Neto wrote poems and articles about the suffering of the Angolans. This created awareness among the nationals. Neto led the Angolan delegation to Lisbon to present the Angolan grievances. This was intended to effect political reforms and independence. Agostinho organized demonstrations and strikes against the Portuguese imperialism. He was part of the Angola cotton worker strike in Malange. He represented and sought recognition from OAU. The OAU responded by giving moral. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. He diffused ethnicity and united the different tribes in Angola. These included the Bakongo, Mbundu and Ovimbundu for the national cause. He led the MPLA to establish the external guerrilla bases in the neighbouring countries, e.g. Congo Zaire, Zambia and Congo-Brazzaville. He solicited support from the communist countries like USSR, China and Cuba. This led to its getting of moral, financial and military equipment and package of training. He recruited and trained the Angolan masses in guerrilla warfare tactics, and this strengthened the liberation struggles. He launched an armed struggle against the Portuguese colonial rule under MPLA in 1961. He recruited women in the military and political wings of the MPLA. These acted as nurses, cooks and spies. He led MPLA to form Camp Alliance of PAIC of Guinea-Bissau and Frelimo of Mozambique. This alliance was aimed at sharing strategies and logistics for the independence. He led the Angolan nationalists to a negotiation campaign with the socialist Lisbon government under Antonio de Spinola. This led to the independence on Nov 1975. He received the instruments of power at independence in 1975 from the Portuguese. He established the first independent government of black majority. Summary of the problems faced by the Angolans in the struggle for independence. Angola Liberation War began in 1961, led by Agostinho Neto of MPLA against the Portuguese colonial masters. The problems faced by the Angolans included African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. Power struggles among the Angolans, e.g. Daniel Chaipenda against Agostinho Neto, Jonas Savimba against Neto. The divide and rule tactics of the Portuguese, i.e. the Ovimbundu against other tribes. Desire by the Portuguese to continue exploiting the Angola nationalists, i.e. the natural resources like diamond, oil. The repressive policies of the Pied police that tightly spied on the Africans and tortured. Then, the Portuguese exploitative policies of overtaxation and forced labour, land grabbing. The brutal oppressive policies of the Portuguese, i.e. public flogging of leaders, for example Agostinho Neto in 1960. The racial discrimination of the Portuguese assimilation. This created a class of assimilados and indigenas which hampered nationalistic struggles. The delayed independence of neighbouring countries affected Angola, for example Namibia, Zimbabwe. Double standards of the UNO. The existence of the Triumvirate Alliance. The negative effects of Cold War politics that made the native forces to swing in Angola. The use of non-violent methods of demanding independence by the Angolans in early stages. For example demonstration and strikes. The absence of capable and charismatic leaders in the initial stages of the struggles. The negative impact of the Catholic Church that branded the nationalists as terrorists. The creation of rehabilitation centres, reserves used by the Portuguese to torture Africans, and use of Scotch death policy. The conservative leadership of Don Salazar, who refused to bend the wings of change. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. Role of the African Independence Party for Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, PAIC. Reference questions. 1. Assesses the role of the PAIC to the liberation struggle of Guinea-Bissau. 2. To what extent did the PAIC contribute to the collapse of Portuguese rule in Guinea-Bissau? 3. Discuss the contribution of PAIC to the liberation struggle in Guinea-Bissau. Preamble. The PAIC was a nationalist movement formed in 1954 by Amilcar Cabral. The intention of the movement was to achieve independence for Guinea-Bissau and the islands of Cape Verde. The roles of PAIC included the following. PAIC appealed to the urban working class traders and primary teachers. These were a pillar for leadership and financial backup. PAIC recruited freedom fighters and trained them in guerrilla warfare. The movement established external bases in Guinea-Conakry and Senegal. This enabled careful attacks against the Portuguese. PAIC launched a successful armed struggle against the Portuguese in 1963 that weakened the colonial bondage. PAIC organized demonstrations and striked against the Portuguese administration. This involved the 1959 Docker strike. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. The movement established internal liberated zones in Guinea-Bissau. There were provision of grassroots democracy, free education, and health centers, hence increasing the popularity of independence. PAIC recruited women in its ranks. These were informer spies, cooks, nurses, etc. This greatly contributed to the success of independence. PAIC sent the youth wing abroad for further studies in military education. Majority went to the Society Union and Algeria, which strengthened the struggle. PAIC went into alliance with other liberation movements of Emploi and Frelimo to form COMP. This alliance was pivotal in sharing strategies. The movement diffused ethnicity and united the people in Guinea-Bissau. The Balonte and Fulo were united for a national cause of independence. The party took part in the negotiations with the government of Antonio de Spinola in Portugal. This yielded independence in 1974. PAIC won the support of the Organization of African Unity OAU. OAU used its Liberation Committee to give financial, military and impose sanctions on Portugal. The party petitioned Portuguese government to the United Nations Security Council. The sanctions were imposed on the Portuguese, which quickened independence. PAIC accepted and received the instruments of power in September 1974 under Louis Cabral as president. The role of Amilcar Cabral in the struggle of Guinea-Bissau. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. Amilcar Cabral got involved in agricultural census with the colonial government. This exposed him to the problems of his people, hence condemned the Portuguese. Amilcar mobilized the masses to form PAIC that launched an armed struggle in 1963 against the Portuguese imperialists. Amilcar established an external base for PAIC in Guinea-Conakry to coordinate the activities of Africans under the support of Sékou Touré. Amilcar worked with the working class and petty traders to get financial and moral support to weaken the Portuguese policies. Amilcar solicited for support from the communist countries like USSR, China, Cuba, and Czechoslovakia. These responded financially and militarily to strengthen African cause for independence. Amilcar also sent members of PAIC Youth Wing to USSR for further education. These returned with more exposed technical skills to further independence cause. Amilcar provided able, visionary, and charismatic leadership under PAIC. He therefore instilled a spirit of hard work and fighting for independence. Amilcar Cabral enlisted women in the struggle for self-rule. These cooked food for the fighters, served as nurses, and acted as spies against the Portuguese. He also sought recognition from the OAU right from 1963. The OAU gave financial, moral, technical, and military support. It imposed sanctions on the Portuguese. Amilcar appealed for support from the UNO that responded positively. The UNO used the African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. Amilcar coordinated the military wings of PAIC up to 1973 when he was assassinated. The cause was later furthered by his cousin, Louis Cabral, to 1974 at independence celebrations. Note: other factors for the success of the Liberation War are the same in all the Portuguese colonies. The Liberation War in Mozambique 1964-1975. The role of Mozambique Liberation Front Frelimo. Reference questions. 1. Discuss the role of Frelimo to the liberation struggle of Mozambique. 2. Assess the contribution of Frelimo in the struggle of Mozambique independence. Preamble. Frelimo was formed by a group of disgruntled intellectuals and politicians in 1962 in Dar es Salaam. It was led by Eduardo Chivambo Mondlane and assisted by Simango. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. 4. Frelimo sensitized and mobilized the nationals who responded by giving full support to the struggle. 5. Frelimo managed to set up internal liberated zones in Nisa and Entiete. These were used to launch attacks on the Portuguese and had reforms established. 6. Frelimo provided able and charismatic leadership under Mondlane that worked against the Portuguese colonial bondage. 7. Frelimo won the support of the communist countries like China, Soviet Union, etc. These gave training, financial and extended educational scholarships to freedom fighters. 8. Frelimo weakened ethnicity in Mozambique. It united the tribes of Macua, Nyanya and the famous Macon, leading to success. 9. The party appealed for assistance and recognition from the United Nations UNO. The UN responded by condemning Portugal and imposing sanctions. 10. Frelimo sought for support from OAU that used its Liberations Committee to support the freedom fighters. 11. Frelimo went into the alliance with MPLA and PAIC to form CUNP. 12. Frelimo scored military success against the Portuguese. This included the killing of Portuguese soldiers and destruction of planes at Muda, leading to success. 13. Frelimo recruited women in liberation struggles. These provided espionage and served as cooks and nurses. 14. The movement held discussions with the socialist government of Antonio of Portugal. African history. The Pan-African movement since 1900 today. PAM. The collapse of the Triumvirate Alliance. The geographical setup of Mozambique favoured the guerrilla warfare. The withdrawal of NATO forces from Mozambique weakened the Portuguese. The role of liberal Portuguese who advocated for democratic governance in Africa. Portuguese economic collapse made it unable to sustain wars. The simultaneous occurrence of liberation wars, i.e. Mozambique 1964, Angola 1961, and Guinea-Bissau 1963. The Portuguese exploitative policies hardened Africans to get determined for independence. The role of independent neighbouring states, for example Tanzania, Zambia and Malawi. The role of other liberation movements, for example Revolutionary Committee of Mozambique, Corimo and ZANU-PF. The Lisbon coup of 1974 that overthrew dictators like Marcel Quitana and Emergenzo. Antonio de Spinor. The role of Samora Machel and Joaquim Chissana. The role of Eduardo Chivambo Mondlane in the liberation struggle. Reference questions. 1. Assess the role of Eduardo Mondlane in the liberation of Mozambique. 2. Explain the contribution of Eduardo Mondlane in the decolonization of Mozambique. 3. To what extent did Eduardo Mondlane contribute to the liberation of Mozambique? Preamble. Eduardo Mondlane established Frelimo in 1962 as a merger of different movements to include MONU, Corimo operating in exile. The roles of Mondlane included: he formed Frelimo in 1962 in exile in Dar es Salaam that helped Mozambique attain independence. African history. The Pan-African movement since 1900 today. PAM. He mobilized and recruited the freedom fighters in Mozambique, trained them in guerrilla warfare leading to independence. Mondlane solicited assistance from the UNO. Mondlane appealed for support from the OAU. Mondlane united the people of Mozambique. These included tribes like Macon, Macua, Nyanya and Tsonga. Eduardo mobilized the working class and the business community to render support to the cause of Mozambique independence. Mondlane enlisted women in the liberation struggle. Mondlane held negotiations with the socialist Portuguese government of Antonio de Spinola, which consequently yielded independence. Civil wars in Portuguese colonies. Civil wars were fought shortly after independence and they heightened disunity. These included Angola 1975-2002, Mozambique 1977-1994, the Civil WAR in Angola 1975-2002. Reference questions. 1. Explain the causes and effects of the civil war in Angola in 1975. 2. Account for the collapse of political peace in Angola in 1975. 3. Explain the factors for the collapse of national unity in Angola in 1975. Preamble. Reference has to be made that as soon as Angola attained independence on 11 November 1975, the new MPLA government of Agostinho Neto and later Eduardo dos Santos conflicted with the alliance of UNIT of Jonas Savimbi and FNLA of Halden Roberto, leading to war, i.e. civil war. Causes of the Civil War. 1. The colonial history/legacy of Angola contributed to the Civil War. It should be noted that the Portuguese divided the Angolans on tribal basis. These tribes included the Bakongo, Mbundu and Over-Mbundu, hence creating hatred and micro-nationalism. Hence, African history. The Pan-African movement since 1900 today. PAM. 3. The militarization of Angola inevitably caused the Civil War. All the rival liberation movements had established an army to fight the Portuguese in the struggle for independence. MPLA had 1.5 million troops, UNIT had 2 million, and FNLA had 700,000 soldiers. All these were not disarmed and put their armies to test after independence. 4. Ethnic differences in Angola caused the Civil War. It is true that the country was divided along tribal lines. For example, the MPLA had the support of the Mbundu, UNIT had the Over-Mbundu, and FNLA had the Bakongo. This increased ethnic disunity leading to the war. 5. Ideological differences caused by Cold War politics made the Civil War in Angola inevitable. The MPLA party had the support of the communist states led by Cuba and Soviet Union. On the contrary, UNITA and FNLA had the patronage of capitalist states. This left the nationalists divided ideologically, making the war unavoidable. 6. Personal ambitions of the nationalists caused the war. The power clash between Emperor of Neto failed to compromise with Roberto Holden of FNLA and Savimbi of UNITA. Militarism was the only solution to the rivaling nationalists. 7. The uncompromising character of Jonas Savimbi caused the civil war in Angola. He was power-hungry, had captured some parts of Angola and accumulated wealth, rejected peace talks from the UNO and OAU organized meetings. He said, "I will never rest unless I become president of Angola." 8. The discriminative policy of Agostinho Neto caused the civil war in Angola. He was very arrogant and never allowed to share power with other parties like FNLA and UNITA yet. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. 10. The failure of the Nakuru Peace Accord Protocol of 1974 worsened the political climate in Angola. This was chaired by President Atwell of Kenya to create a coalition government of the parties, i.e. MPLA, UNITA and FNLA. This didn't come to pass as all the resolutions were not respected both by Neto and the divergent interests of UNITA under Jonas Savimbi, hence causing the civil war. 11. The natural resource endowment of Angola caused the war. Angola had minerals like diamonds and oil, and each party desired to have control of the minerals. For example, UNITA under Savimbi controlled the diamond deposits in Cabinda, which made him strong. MPLA made a controversial deal with the European mining companies not to benefit the whole country. This war was declared to compel the government MPLA to stop the Europeans' mining companies. 12. The double standards of the UNO inevitably caused the Angolan War. The UN Security Council condemned the civil war in Angola and wanted peace to prevail. However, other members of UNO like USA secretly supported UNITA of Savimbi by selling weapons in exchange of minerals. This left the Angolan politics divided, hence the civil war. 13. The presence of Cuban troops in Angola partly caused the civil war. These had been brought to assist the MPLA to mitigate South African aggression. This made the capitalist USA to extend resistance to UNITA, hence increasing hostility leading to the civil war. 14. The failure of the Angola Peace Accords of 1989 also led to the civil war. This was signed between the Russian President Gorbachev and the American President Ronald Reagan. These invited the conflicting MPLA and UNITA on a round table to resolve the conflicts. The proposal was rejected by UNITA under Savimbi, hence complicating the peace in Angola. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. 3. Agriculture was disrupted due to lack of concentration and fear. Famine inevitably rocked Angola. 4. The war caused heavy government expenditure as the MPLA government spent millions on buying military hardware to sustain the war. 5. The war caused displacement of Angolans for the safety of their lives. The neighboring countries experienced refugee crises like Congo, Zaire, Namibia. 6. Angola became a center of Cold War politics attributed to the support of superpowers. UNITA had the support of the capitalists, for example USA and South Africa, and MPLA attracted the attention of USSR and Cuba. These became proxy wars for superpowers. 7. The civil war promoted neocolonialism in Angola. It forced Portugal to continue influencing the policies in Angola. Angola was also forced to sell her minerals, i.e. oil and diamonds, to developed nations in exchange of military equipment. 8. The civil militarized the politics of Angola as the culture of the gun was the solution in the country. MPLA and UNITA rearmed themselves to have political power in the country. 9. The civil escalated divisions and hatred in the country. National unity was compromised and avenues to democracy were futile. The government of Dos Santos of MPLA organized the elections of 1992 and the results were rejected by UNITA. This caused more problems in the country. 10. The Angolan Civil War exposed the weaknesses of the OAU and UNO in solving African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. 12. The Angolan Civil War attracted the attention of international agencies like ICRC, International Committee of Red Cross, UNICEF, UNHCR. These extended social services and other forms of assistance, for example food, medicine, to the war victims. The Civil War in Mozambique 1977–1994. Mozambique drifted to political unrest shortly after getting independence from Portugal. The civil war between Frelimo under Samora Machel and the Renamo Mozambique. National resistance under Alfonso Dhlakama. Causes of the war. 1. The Portuguese policy of divide and rule caused the war. Tribalism was promoted and other minority tribes, for example the Nyani, were against the Makan that dominated Frelimo. This continued even after independence. 2. The unfair representation in the new independent government caused the civil war. The Frelimo government ignored other parties like Corimo, yet these played a central role in the liberation of Mozambique. These parties of Corimo and Renamo got disgruntled. 3. The dictatorship of Samora Machel of Frelimo caused the war. Other political parties were banned, and yet they needed to actively take part in the decision-making of the country. This resulted into bloodshed organized by Renamo against Frelimo. 4. The uncompromising character of Samora and later Joachim Chissano caused the war. Chissano, who replaced Mashal in 1986 after the assassination, was very repressive and censored the press. All these caused a war in 1977. 5. The increased militarism in the country caused a war. The War of Independence made the country to have military bases, i.e. Frelimo and Renamo. These were not. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. 7. High rate of unemployment and poverty caused the Civil War. The Frelimo did not put in place any tangible strategy to uplift the standards of living of the people. These caused frustrations among the war veterans, hence the Civil War. 8. Existence of micronationalism in Mozambique caused the war. Most tribes valued their norms, culture at the expense of national unity, for example the Makand, Nan and Makuan. All these stem from colonial history. 9. Ideological differences in Mozambique caused the war. Frelimo adopted a communist policy that led to the nationalization of property in the country. Therefore, the rich citizens and Renamo that opted for capitalism launched the civil war in the country. 10. The influence of South Africa in the affairs of Mozambique caused the war. The apartheid regime feared communism in Mozambique and its role as a member of frontline states that supported the ANC of South African blacks. Therefore, South Africa gave support to Renamo in Mozambique. 11. Neo-colonialism in Mozambique caused the civil war. The Portuguese continued to influence policies in Mozambique majorly to the Renamo rebels. The Portuguese had lost capital in the Wars of Independence, hence decided to establish links with the rebels in Mozambique. Other factors: weaknesses of the OAU, the double standards of the UNO, the influence of the civil war in Angola, i.e. Savimbi of UNITA shared the experiences of the war with Lacom Alfonso. Effects of the war: 1. Led to loss of lives and property, i.e. about 1.5 million people died in the war. 2. Resulted into economic retardation of the Mozambique economy, i.e. agriculture and industrialization registered a setback. 3. The war resulted into the assassination of Samora Machel in a plane crash in 1986. The blame was put on the apartheid government in Pretoria to have masterminded as it gave support to Renamo forces. 4. Led to heavy government expenditure leading to heavy external borrowing. This increased the debt burden of Mozambique. 5. Undermined national unity in Mozambique due to neocolonial tendencies. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. 6. Worsened the relationship between the government of Mozambique and the apartheid South African government. 7. Cold War politics was promoted in Mozambique. 8. Refugee crisis increased, most especially in the southern African states. 9. International community organizations increased their assistance to Mozambique, for example, UNICEF, UNHCR, ICRC, etc. These put strategies to end the war in 1994 after signing a ceasefire, i.e. Chissano, Frelimo and Renamo. 10. The Renamo became a legitimate political party and allowed to take part in national elections. Most soldiers of Renamo were integrated in the National Army of Frelimo. 11. Weaknesses of the OAU and the UNO were exposed in their failure to end the crisis in Mozambique. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS. It was formed in Lagos in Nigeria on 25 May 1975, and the treaty that established it was in Lome in Togo 1976. It is composed of 16 member states to include Nigeria, Niger, Ghana, Gabon, Benin, Mali, Ivory Coast, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea-Conakry, etc. The last country to join was Cape Verde. It cut across the Anglophone and Francophone states. Aims/objectives of ECOWAS: to promote economic competition and integration, to promote viable infrastructural development, mainly transport and communication, to promote free trade and movement of people, to promote agriculture through a joint project between member states, to achieve the common market and single currency, to settle regional conflicts, to promote education, to establish the West African Parliament, to promote industrial development and avoid duplication of goods and services. Achievements: intervened and settled regional conflicts in West Africa, i.e. brought peace in Liberia after the years of bloodshed following the murder of Sergeant Samuel Durr, i.e. ensured peace. And African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. Filled the economic gap which was created after the withdrawal of the Europeans, i.e. colonial masters. ECOWAS provided economic assistance to the members of West Africa to alleviate economic hardships. Funded the West African Power Pool, WAP, for example, Diamond and Richard Toll dams in Senegal. Promoted free movement of people through the removal of visa restrictions and passports. This created jobs, promoted cultural fusion and a sense of unity in the region. ECOWAS promoted free trade by removing trade barriers, for example tariffs, embargoes and quotas. They adopted a trade liberalization scheme that boosted economic development. Promoted education in West Africa. This was through students' exchange schemes, and this elevated the quality of education. ECOWAS promoted cooperation in the member states. These countries worked together to address economic and social aspirations of the people in West Africa. ECOWAS promoted Pan-Africanism, i.e. unity, solidarity and preservation of independence. This explains the West Africans' role in cementing African unity, i.e. Ghana, Nigeria, etc. ECOWAS has promoted agriculture and agro-processing industries. Agricultural production, export trade increased. This mitigated famine. Promoted environmental preservation by adopting a scheme in 1982 of reforestation in the Sahel region. ECOWAS promoted infrastructural development in West Africa. It developed ports, dams, harbours, roads, railway and airports. These improved on the movement of people and commodities and enhanced socio-economic development. ECOWAS mobilized international aid for West African states. Countries organized both financial and military aid from European Union, i.e. NATO, USA, and these have contributed to technical support to ECOMOG to have a battalion to keep peace in West Africa. Failures of ECOWAS/challenges. ECOWAS has been characterized with political instabilities in form of civil wars, internal conflicts and military coups, for example Togo, Nigeria, Ivory Coast. The interstate conflicts have dogged the integration. For example, in 1984, Ghana closed her borders to the rest of the member states, Nigeria vs Cameroon over the Bokossi Peninsula. African history. The Pan-African movement since 1900 today PAM failed to eradicate poverty in the region. Many countries in West Africa are too poor and have failed to meet the financial obligations. For example, Togo has always defaulted. There has been competition for the MNCS. This has led to provision of cheap commodities which flood the market and end up dictating the prices of goods in the region. The ECOWAS has failed to have a common currency. This has created a problem of exchange rates. Currencies used are pegged on the medium of exchange of the former colonial masters, for example pounds, hence hindering free trade. Failed to have common political ideologies, i.e. capitalism and communism/Marxism. This intensified conflicts and undermined the activities of the integration. Challenges of ECOWAS. Vastness of the West African sub-region, i.e. bigger nations, for example Nigeria, used the size to dominate the ECOWAS. Poverty and indebtedness of the member states. Civil wars, for example Liberia and Sierra Leone. Ideological differences among the member states. Limited personnel in the ECOMOG force. Lack of a common language. Differences in colonial backgrounds has affected long-term decision-making. Neo-colonial influence/interference from the West. Military coups. Falling prices of agricultural products, for example rubber, cocoa, weaken the economies. Differences in the level of development, hence hampering cooperation. Severe drought of 1982. Border conflicts. Rise of illicit trade/smuggling across the national borders. Disrespect among leaders, for example ECOWAS countries. Failure to respect ECOWAS agreements/delay to implement agreements. Poor infrastructure due to limited funding of infrastructural development. Absence of laws governing the foreign investors. African history. The Pan-African movement since 1900 today PAM. African socialism in Tanzania. African socialism in Tanzania was adopted through the Arusha Declaration of 1967 and implemented through the Ujamaa scheme/policy. The Arusha Declaration was a government paper that ushered the Ujamaa policy. The Ujamaa policy/scheme referred to the spirit of brotherhood, familyhood. It required the majority Tanzanians to go back to the villages for effective national development. NB, the policy was adopted by Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere in 1967 and stretched to 1985. Aim/objectives of Ujamaa policy/African socialism/Arusha Declaration of 1967. 1. It was aimed at creating a classless society in Tanzania, egalitarian. 2. The concept was aimed at cementing national unity in Tanzania. 3. To increase agricultural production through better use of labor. 4. It was aimed at promoting self-reliance and defend the independence of Tanzania. 5. The desire to prevent neo-colonialism or foreign influence and hegemony. 6. To mobilize masses for national defense and development. 7. The need to eradicate poverty from Tanzania. 8. Nyerere also aimed at ensuring industrial development. 9. The need to uplift the standards of living of the people. 10. To ensure food security and eradicate famine through agricultural modernization. 11. To promote equality and reduce income inequality. 12. To fight corruption in government and party officials. 13. To ensure rural development and transformation in Kurburam. 14. To create a national language and ease communication. Sample questions account for the adoption of African socialism in Tanzania. Approach. Give a viable definition. African history. The Pan-African movement since 1900 today PAM. Socialism followed a one-party system, i.e. Tanzania African National Union TANU, which later became to be the Chama cha Mapinduzi CCM. The policy of socialism was composed of income equality and strongly castigated differentials in society. There was forced villagization, i.e. people were encouraged to go and develop rural areas. The policy emphasized the revival of African cultural values in Tanzania. It emphasized centralized planning. The central government of Naira originated all the policies and handed down to the villages. Socialism featured patriotism among the people of Tanzania, a virtue intended to have deep love for the nation and work towards its development. The policy of socialism featured the introduction of a national language, Kiswahili. This forged unity and eased communication. The policy encouraged social justice and welfare, i.e. education and medical facilities in the villages. Socialism encouraged hard work among the Tanzanians, as also people had a responsibility to work for the nation. The policy put more emphasis on agriculture with the intention to have adequate food to mitigate famine. It featured the development of small-scale industries. These were majorly set up on the established farms to add value. Socialism emphasized self-reliance and reduced the negative effects of external borrowing associated with negative evils. Grassroots democracy was reflected in the socialism of Tanzania. These were in form of village councils in line with the central government requirements. The policy of socialism laid more emphasis on lower education, i.e. universal primary education. The policy emphasized the national defense of Tanzania through the creation of an army, i.e. Tanzania People's Defense Forces (TPDF). Socialism emphasized unity through the removal of classes in society which ensured consolidated development. Achievements/successes/strengths of African socialism in Tanzania. Arusha Declaration. African history. The Pan-African movement since 1900 today. PAM. Political. 1. The policy led to the establishment of a strong national army, i.e. the Tanzanian People's Defense Force (TPDF). This promoted order and stability in Tanzania. 2. African socialism encouraged national unity and brotherhood among the people of Tanzania. This was attributed to the collective effort of the nationals. 3. The policy gave Tanzanians a leadership code that shaped a people-centered leadership. This was because of the creation of village councils and people with potential leaders of CCM. 4. Socialism in Tanzania promoted democracy of grassroots where the masses in the Ujama villages could vote their own leaders. 5. The Ujama policy encouraged nationalism and a spirit of patriotism among the Tanzanians. Julius Nyerere tried to instill a spirit of love for the country. 6. Socialism attempted to reduce on the levels of corruption and embezzlement in public institutions. This was through putting in place stringent measures against corruption. Economic. 7. The policy encouraged hard work in the initial stages. This tried to alleviate laziness among the Tanzanians. 8. It increased agricultural production like the maize boom of 1978. This went a long way in creating food security and increased revenue for Tanzania. 9. The policy led to the establishment of physical infrastructure like feeder roads in the Ujama villages. These eased marketing of agricultural products. 10. The Ujama policy introduced a progressive taxation system in Tanzania. This is where the high-income earners were more taxed than the low-income earners, hence reducing conflicts in society. 11. The policy promoted tourism where tourists frequented Tanzania to witness an African system that challenges Western capitalism. 12. Socialism led to the nationalization of the major means of production like land. Land was redistributed to the masses, especially in the Ujama villages, which encouraged higher productivity. 13. Industrialization was promoted in Tanzania. There were small-scale processing and cottage. African history. The Pan-African movement since 1900 today. PAM. 16. The policy led to the provision of better social services like piped water, improved health services, and education. This improved on the standard of living. 17. Socialism in Tanzania encouraged literacy through the provision of universal primary education and adult literacy campaigns. This literacy mainly emphasized agricultural education. 18. Ujama encouraged equal opportunities for all in order to reduce the gap between the haves and have-nots. This limited the civil servants to one job to create room for other citizens. 19. Socialism led to the forging/creation of Kiswahili as a national language. This eased communication, promoted trade, and consolidated unity in Tanzania. 20. Cooperative societies were created in Tanzania. This compelled the rural farmers to come together for resource mobilization, hence increasing output. 21. The policy promoted African culture among the Ujama villages. This was because of the settlement of the people together and sharing ideas based on African structural setup. Shortcomings/failures/weaknesses of Ujama. 1. Ujama promoted single-party democracy in Tanzania through Chama cha Mapinduzi CCM. This groomed dictatorship in Tanzania and undermined the objectives of African socialism. 2. The policy failed to promote self-reliance in Tanzania. This is evidenced when Naira from 1971 began encouraging foreign investment in Tanzania. 3. The policy promoted economic backwardness in Tanzania. This was attributed to the unfriendly policies that the masses did not get involved in. 4. The Ujamaa policy failed to give Tanzania an independent and sustainable political system it desired. It therefore collapsed in 1985 with the demise of Naira from the political scene. 5. The policy did not have appeal from the majority Tanzanians. The policy was imposed on the citizens without due consultation, hence a weakness. 6. The Ujamaa policy was composed of forceful villagization, and this promoted the African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today PAM. 9. The system promoted some traces of capitalism, i.e. private ownership of property. This widened the gap between the haves and have-nots in society, and it undermined the equality in society. 10. The Ujamaa villages promoted congestion with all the associated problems like inadequate provision of social services and called for diseases like cholera and typhoid. 11. The principle of communism undermined the initiative to work. It therefore promoted laziness among people and the spirit of hard work was undermined. 12. The system was dominated by corruption and embezzlement of government funds. The officials of the policy became inefficient and accepted bribes, and this was common among the CCM members. 13. The Ujamaa policy ignored higher education in Tanzania. Elementary education was emphasized with lower primary being favored. Manpower gap became so high in open neo-colonial experts. 14. Socialism promoted neo-colonialism in Tanzania. This was attributed to excessive borrowing from the capitalist world and other foreign investors from 1975. This undermined the aims of Ujamaa. 15. The levels of industrialization remained very low in Tanzania, attributed to Ujamaa policy. The policy promoted small-scale and processing industries. Tanzania largely depended on the importation of manufactured goods that reduced the foreign exchange. 16. The policy promoted an environmental deforestation in Tanzania. This is because large tracts of forests were cut in order to create land for agriculture and settlement. The rainfall totals reduced and climatic imbalance was witnessed. 17. The Ujamaa policy was very expensive to be sustained in Tanzania. This compelled the government of Julius Nyerere to borrow funds from international financial institutions, hence making Tanzania become indebted. Reference questions. 1. Account for the adoption of the one-party system of government in Tanzania after independence. 2013. 2. Examine the contribution of Julius Nyerere to the history of Tanzania up to 1985-2012. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today PAM. Give the role/positive role of Nyerere. Give failures. Standpoint. Nyerere was the first president of the Republic of Tanzania and led the country in 1961 to 1985. Roles political. 1. Transformed Tanganyika African Association TA in 1954. 2. Led Tanganyika to independence in 1961. 3. Promoted multiracial unity between Arabs and Africans. 4. Spearheaded the merger between Tanganyika and Zanzibar in 1964. 5. Promoted socialism in Tanzania under the 1967 Arusha Declaration. 6. Created a People's Army, ITPDF in Tanzania. 7. Promoted mass nationalism/patriotism in Tanzania. 8. Promoted territorial sovereignty of Tanzania. Defended the boundaries of Tanzania, especially the Amin's time in Uganda. 9. Provided exemplary leadership to the people of Tanzania. 10. Maintained political stability in Tanzania. 11. Promoted egalitarianism/equality in Tanzania. Economic role/contribution. Promoted agricultural modernization in Tanzania. Nationalized the major means of production, i.e. land. Created the Ujamaa villages that promoted/boosted production. Created cooperative movements which eased the marketing of agricultural products. Promoted small-scale industries, i.e. processing of agricultural products. Changed the attitude of people towards work. Led to infrastructural developments, for example roads. Emphasized rural development through the Ujamaa village. Promoted income equality which reduced conflicts. Promoted self-reliance in Tanzania in the initial years of independence to reduce effects of neo-colonialism. Redistributed land in Tanzania. Social contribution. Created a national language, Kiswahili, which consolidated unity in trade. Promoted education through elementary structure of lower primary. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today PAM. Redesigned the education system to suit the needs of the people. Negative contribution/weaknesses political. Promoted dictatorship through one-party system, CCM. Corruption persisted. Failed to fight neo-colonialism. Socialism failed in Tanzania. Conflicted with neighboring states, i.e. Uganda. Economic. Failed to increase agricultural production, i.e. famine struck the country in the 1970s. Made Tanzania to register shortage of foreign exchange due to limited exports. The policy of self-reliance failed under Nyerere. There was low industrial development or output due to the small-scale industries. Communal farming failed. Nyerere mismanaged the state enterprises. Income inequality persisted. failed to fully handle the unemployment problem. Farmers' associations offered low prices for the produce. Naira accumulated foreign debts for Tanzania. Social. Widespread poverty persisted. Diluted the education system. Destabilized Tanzania and they lost touch with their relatives. The Uganda villages he created led to overcrowding with associated problems. 1. Assess the contribution of African socialism to the development of Tanzania between 1967 and 1985. 2. Examine the impact of the 1967 Arusha Declaration in the modernization of Tanzania. 3. To what extent did the Ujima policy contribute to nation building in Tanzania? Preamble. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today PAM. African socialism in Tanzania was adopted through the Arusha Declaration of 1967 and implemented through the Ujima scheme. Other factors. Colonial legacy, i.e. Western policies introduced by the Germans and the colonial developments by the British. Good and focused leadership, for example Nyerere and his successors. Geographical location of Tanzania, i.e. at the eastern coastline of Africa with harbors like Dar es Salaam. Early contact with the people of the Middle East, for example Sayage rule at the coast, for example the introduction of cloves. The role of Kiswahili, which promoted unity and patriotism. Membership to the EAC and SADC. The sparse population of Tanzania. The role of the Tanzam Railway. Communist support, especially from China, that aided the modernization of the harbour at Dar es Salaam Railway. Tanzanian membership to the OAU/O, for example the headquarters of the Liberation Committee. Lack of a strong dominating ethnic group, thus leading to national unity and development. Existence of mineral resources, for example diamond at Mwadui. Existence of foreign investments, i.e. multinational companies to increase revenue and job creation. The Organization of African Unity OAU. The OAU was a continental African body that was founded on 25 May 1963 at a conference in Addis Ababa by 32 independent African states. It reconciled the Casablanca and Monrovia ideological groupings to have a common union charter. Aims/objectives of OAU. To promote African unity and solidarity. To defend the sovereignty of states and integrity. To eradicate all forms of colonialism in Africa. To promote international cooperation. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today PAM. To coordinate and intensify cooperation of African states. To respect human rights in accordance with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. Achievements/successes of OAU, these include 1. The OAU achieved continental unity. This was exhibited by the one voice spoken by the member states during the summits and conventions. 2. Promoted international cooperation. This was due to the good relations between the United Nations and the European Economic Community, i.e. the current European Union. This increased joint and global problem solving. 3. OAU contributed to the eradication of colonialism in Africa. This was through the Liberation Committee in Tanzania. The committee mobilized and extended support to the Mobilization Liberation Front Frelimo and Kiswapa, which aided countries to get independence. 4. The OAU tried to solve interstate conflicts in Africa. This was through the Mediation and Reconciliation Commission to alleviate misunderstandings, for example Somalia and Ethiopia over the Ogaden Province 1976-1977, Congo and Uganda, Morocco and Algeria, etc. 5. Managed to expand membership from 32 in 1963 to include almost the entire continent. This was a remarkable achievement, and it reprimanded states which acted contrary to the objectives, such as Morocco. 6. Succeeded in condemning secessionism and balkanization of the African continent. These included the Katanga Secession 1960-1963, Biafra Nigeria 1967-1970. This consolidated the independence of African states. 7. Promoted regional economic integrations in Africa. These included the setting up of EAC in 1967, Economic Community of West African States in 1975, COMESA in 1993, and SADC in 1979. 8. Tried to settle the refugee problem in Africa. This was done through the Commission for Refugees established in 1965. African states tried to settle IDPs in camps in conjunction with UNHCR. The OAU also set up a general fund to extend assistance, i.e. food, medicine, and shelter. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today PAM. 9. Revived and preserved African culture. This was achieved through organizing African cultural festivals like in Nigeria in 1973 and others held in Egypt. The organization also encouraged games and sports through the All-African Games hosted in South Africa. 10. Promoted democratic governance and democracy in Africa. This was done through castigating the occurrence of coups during its tenure, for example the 1965 coups in Algeria and Congo, 1971 in Uganda, etc. Leaders who proved to be dictators were encouraged to institute elections and respect the rights of masses, Algeria under Sani Abacha, Bokassa and Mariam Mengistu. 11. The OAU established the African Development Bank in Abidjan in Ivory Coast. This extended development loans to African states and gave the lowest interest rates in order to prevent borrowing from the Western banks. 12. Promoted scientific research in Africa. This was through the Science and Technological Commission of OAU. The African Medical Research Fund AMREF worked with international organizations to eradicate diseases and encourage the use of local herbs, control diseases, for example East Coast fever, locusts in Central Africa, etc. 13. Condemned civil wars on the African continent. The OAU also tried to physically intervene in the ending of civil wars, for example the 1965-1982 Chadi War. The OAU tried to lay strategies by condemning African countries involved and called for peace. 14. The body condemned the continuous assassination of African leaders. This had become prevalent, like Sankara of Burkina Faso, Samora Machel of Mozambique, Anwar Sadat of Egypt, Laurent Kabila of Congo, among others. 15. The OAU called upon members to adopt or embrace the idea of non-aligned movement (NAM). The policy emphasized neutrality during Cold War politics of superpowers. Member countries were discouraged from allowing the USA or the USSR to set up military. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. PAM. Failures/weaknesses of OAU. 1. Failed to establish a continental armed force high command. This made it too weak to check wars and rebel activities, and observing total peace at the continent remained a dream. 2. Failed to have an African parliament where continental challenges could be addressed. 3. Failed to achieve the desired United States of Africa due to intrigue and squabbles among the member states. 4. Failed to ensure complete and total decolonization of the continent. This is evident with the Western Sahara under the influence of Morocco. 5. Failed to end military coups on the continent, for example 1971 and 1985 in Uganda, 1966 July and January in Nigeria, 1966 in Ghana, 1980 Liberian coup, among others. 6. Failed to end the interstate conflicts, for example Uganda and Tanzania, i.e. Amin's regime, Nigeria and Cameroon border conflicts. 7. Failed to enforce the idea of NAM, and neo-colonialism became prevalent. This is because of the dire need for development aid. In 1970 to 2002, African countries received $294 billion. This made countries to struggle in servicing the loans. 8. Failed to do away with the dictators on the continent, for example Bokassa of CAR, Amin in Uganda, Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, Sani Abacha in Nigeria. This increased neo-colonialism to entrench in power, but OAU maintained the principle of non-interference. 9. Failed to get a permanent remedy to refugee crisis. This was due to the rampant wars not addressed that made Africans migrate across the continent, for example Sierra Leone, Liberia, Somalia, Rwanda, Congo and Burundi. This increased suffering. 10. The OAU failed to enforce the subscription of the financial obligations. This hindered OAU to finance its set budget on the continent. 11. Failed to wipe out poverty on the continent. Africans were ranked the first in poverty in the world. Majority live below $1 a day, disease and ignorant. The income per capita of Africa was very low. 12. Abuse of human rights remained a big challenge. These were eminent during dictatorial regimes of Amin in Uganda, Mobutu of Zaire, etc., which tarnished the African continent. Africa and history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. PAM. Challenges/obstacles/problems to OAU. 1. Lack of a common continental language made it difficult for the OAU to promote meaningful cooperation. 2. The frequent occurrence of military coups which undermined the work of the OAU in promoting democracy. 3. The presence of dictators in Africa like Mobutu in Congo, Bokassa, CAR, Mengistu in Ethiopia, Amin in Uganda and Mugabe in Zimbabwe. 4. The OAU was greatly overwhelmed by the growing number of refugees. This presented a burden to the host member countries by sharing the scarce resources. 5. Poorly developed infrastructure between the member states. This limited trade and economic cooperation among the member states. 6. Interstate conflicts became a major challenge, i.e. Uganda vs Tanzania during Amin's era, Ethiopia and Somalia over Ogaden, Nigeria vs Cameroon. 7. The presence of neo-colonialism, hence making African states to attain total decolonization. 8. The oil crisis of 1973-1974 drastically affected the effective operation of OAU, i.e. made countries to adopt and adverse strategies effective regional economic integration. 9. The failure of the member states of OAU to meet the subscriptions made the work very hard. 10. The frequent outbreak of civil wars in Africa, i.e. Chad, Congo, Nigeria, Angola, Somalia and Sudan. 11. General illiteracy among the masses of the OAU member states. This undermined the effort of fighting poverty, disease and ignorance. 12. Lack of an international peacekeeping force of its own/army/high command. This made it impossible to intervene to solve the civil wars and other conflicts of the states. 13. assassination of prominent African leaders like Samora Machel in 1986, Anwar Sadat in 1981, Amilcar Cabral in 1973, Chris Hani in 1993, etc. 14. Ideological differences during the Cold War era. This made countries to adopt capitalism like Kenya and Tanzania communism. This affected uniformity in problem solving. 15. The geographical vastness size of the continent. The size of about 12 million square miles hindered the effectiveness in promoting political unity and trade in Africa. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. Several questions. 1. To account for the formation of OAU in 1963. 2. To what extent did the OAU achieve the objectives of its founders? 3. Assess the achievements of the OAU between 1963 and 2002. 4. How successful was the Organization of African Unity in achieving the objectives of the founders? 5. Account for the failure of the OAU to fulfill the objectives of the founders. 6. Explain the problems/challenges of the OAU between 1963 and 2002. The Egyptian Revolution of 1952. The Egyptian Revolution/coup was organized between 22nd and 23rd July 1952 by the Free Officers Movement FOM. The leaders included Abdel Gamal Nasser, Anwar Sadat, and Negroud Muhammad against the despotic regime of King Farouk. Causes of the Egyptian Revolution of 1952. The causes were political, social, and economic in nature. Economic causes. 1. The extravagancy of King Farouk contributed to the outbreak of 1952 revolution. The king spent a lot of taxpayers' money to meet his luxurious life. He constructed mansions for women in Cairo and Alexandria. He was ever on foreign trips to European countries, leading to his unpopularity by 1952. 2. King Farouk and his government was very corrupt. The king and the Wafdist party leaders were very corrupt and composed of the privileged class in Egypt. These withdrew money from the national treasury and made lavish spending. This accelerated financial bankruptcy in the country, leading to the revolution. 3. Failure of King Farouk to industrialize Egypt led to the coup of 1952. The Egyptian society remained largely backward. There were very few industries established, and the country largely depended on imported goods. This resulted into unemployment, low revenue, hence the revolution. African history, a Pan-African movement since 1900 today, PAM. 5. High levels of poverty among the Egyptians caused the revolution. This was attributed to the low levels of industrialization that made the peasants to live below the poverty line. Majority of the peasants could not afford a meal a day, pay fees for their children, and access medical care, hence creating a revolutionary mood. 6. The overtaxation imposed on the Egyptians led to the revolution. King Farouk and his government imposed retrogressive taxes in Egypt intended to compel the poor people to work hard. However, the royal family, the Wafdist party, were exempted. This made the army officers to organize a revolution in order to institute taxation reforms. 7. Massive unemployment in Egypt led to the collapse of Egyptian monarchy. The levels of unemployment had been created by the neglect of the industrial sector. Also, the Egyptians were not performing well in the agricultural sector in drought conditions given the semi-arid nature of Egypt. Therefore, FOM organized a coup against the Egyptian government. 8. High rates of inflation also caused the Egyptian revolution. The Egyptian economy was characterized by imported goods from countries experiencing inflation, hence imported inflation. High levels of corruption and extravagancy, persisted increase in prices of goods all contributed to inflation, hence creating lack of trust in the government of King Farouk. 9. The continued occupation of the Suez Canal zone by foreigners led to the outbreak of the revolution. The Suez Canal was an international waterway, and it was used for lucrative, profitable trade between Africa and Middle East. However, the taxes were collected by Britain, France, and shared with the government of King Farouk. The army officers wanted to stop the economic imperialism, hint a revolution. Social causes. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to PAM. Education was very expensive, and therefore the peasants would not educate their children. This made the public to get fed up with the government of King Farouk by 1952. 12. The gender inequality in Egypt caused the revolution. There were high levels of women discrimination. Women were not allowed to join politics and civil service, yet they represented the highest percentage of the population. This led to widespread discontent in society, which undermined the government of King Farouk. 13. Nepotism and favoritism practiced by King Farouk led to the overthrow of the Egyptian monarchy. The government of King Farouk reserved all lucrative jobs for the members of the royal family and the cabinet ministers. It is on record that General Mohammed Negroud was dropped as an army commander in favor of King Farouk's cousin, hence this compelled the FOM to organize a coup. 14. Classification in Egypt caused the revolution. King Farouk divided the Egyptian society into 3 classes, i.e. royal family at the top, foreigners, i.e. Turks and Britain in the second class, the businessmen and peasants at the bottom. This inspired Gamal Nasser and the colleagues to overthrow the government. 15. The influence of the Muslim Brotherhood led to the downfall of King Farouk. This movement was formed by Hassan al-Banna. He advocated for Islamic theocracy, and therefore he won the support of Egyptians, leading to the collapse of King Farouk's regime. 16. Outbreak of famine caused the 1952 Egyptian Revolution. This was attributed to land grabbing that left the peasants landless, and Egypt experienced food shortages. The government of King Farouk attempted to import food which was highly expensive to the ordinary people, hence creating a revolutionary situation in 1952. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. Weapons hence its poor performance. Therefore, the FOM organized a coup to discipline the government of King Farouk. 19. Egypt's failure to be active in the Arab politics led to the outbreak of the revolution. Egypt was not highly sounding in matters of the Arab League, and therefore the army decided to overthrow King Farouk and make Egypt become influential in the Arab affairs. 20. The political ambitions of Gamal Nasser contributed to the outbreak of the revolution. Nasser was prompted to take over power right from childhood in secondary school. Nasser also wrote articles criticizing the government of Farouk. The Egyptian government is dominated by corruption. Who will change it? Where is dignity? Where is nationalism? Where is one that can call the activity of the youth? This led to demonstrations which undermined the government of King Farouk. 21. Influence of World War I and II led to the downfall of King Farouk. This war produced a class of ex-servicemen who had military skills. The war also made Egypt to become bankrupt as King Farouk supported the British financially. The war led to inflation and poverty among Egyptians. All these contributed to the toppling of King Farouk's government. 22. Neglect of the Egyptian army by King Farouk led to the revolution. The army didn't have the required logistics in form of uniforms and army boots. The army was poorly paid, poorly accommodated, and no meetings were organized to diagnose the challenges. This compelled the army officers to overthrow the government of King Farouk. 23. Foreign domination in Egypt caused the revolution. It should be noted that Egypt was granted independence in 1922. However, this remained on paper. Egypt was dominated by the British, French, and the Turks, who controlled the resources, for example the Suez Canal zone. Therefore the army officers organized a coup. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. The impact of the Egyptian Revolution. The effects of the revolution on the people of Egypt were political, social, and economic in nature. Social effects. 1. The status of women was improved in Egypt. These were employed as teachers, factory workers, accountants to earn money. The killing of girls in Egypt was banned. Women became cabinet ministers in the government of Gamal Nasser, and many acquired university education. 2. Nasser introduced health reforms. This was accompanied by free medical services. The number of doctors and nurses increased, hospitals, clinics and dispensaries were set up, and this increased the life expectancy of the nationals. 3. Improved on the education sector. This was done by establishment of primary, secondary and universities. Nasser banned the Muslim and non-Muslim courts in Egypt. All cases were referred to the secular government court in an attempt to unite administration and promote justice. 4. Nasser also fought poverty by encouraging family planning. Large families were not encouraged, and Egyptians were limited to 3 children, and other children were to be taxed as promoting the welfare. 5. Nasser encouraged the establishment of low-cost houses in Egypt. The revolutionary government set up houses in Cairo, Alexandria, in order to cater for their standards of living. Economic effects. 6. The Egyptian Revolution led to the formation of state-controlled cooperatives. These. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. 7. There was improvement in the taxation system in Egypt. The revolutionary government introduced the progressive taxation system, where the Egyptians were taxed according to their income. This was contrary to the retrogressive taxes imposed on the poor people. 8. Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956. This had been occupied by the British, the French and the Israelites, hence creating employment opportunities, leading to increased revenue and making Egypt get full independence. 9. The revolution led to the setting up of industries in Egypt. The government of Gamal Nasser came up with a 5-year development plan of 1960-1965, leading to the establishment of manufacturing industries like steel products, tractors, fertilizers in Cairo and Alexandria. 10. The government of Nasser promoted the tourism sector in Egypt. This targeted the Middle East, European countries, using the Suez Canal zone as a shortcut. 11. The government of Gamal Nasser carried out land reclamation in Egypt. This was done through irrigation process in the desert areas of the western parts of Egypt, Al-Qatara. 12. The government of Gamal Nasser carried out land reforms in Egypt. The land which had been grabbed from the Fellahin peasants by the royal family and the Wafdis party was redistributed among the peasants, hence reducing the land pressure. Political effects. 13. The revolution led to the collapse of the Egyptian monarchy. The government of King Farouk was defeated on the 26th of July 1952 and was forced to abdicate his throne and went to exile in Europe. This led to the establishment of the Republican government in Egypt. 14. The Free Officers Movement established a Revolutionary Command Council in Egypt. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. PAM. 17. Nasser fought against the corrupt leaders in Egypt. It is true that the government of King Farouk was dominated by rampant corruption. However, Nasser arrested and tried the corrupt people, though many were pardoned to promote reconciliation. 18. The political prisoners were freed by the government of Gamal Nasser, and this promoted justice and equality in the society. 19. The revolutionary government led to the establishment of a strong army in Egypt. The army was fully trained, equipped using the appropriate weapons in the Soviet Union. USSR. Negative impacts. 20. The government was dominated by inflation. This was attributed to the increased development projects which undermined the value of national currency and led to an increase in the prices of essential goods. 21. The government was dominated by financial bankruptcy. This was due to increased external borrowing that made Egypt to be highly indebted to USA and Britain. 22. There was massive loss of lives and property due to Egypt's involvement in numerous wars, for example the Suez Canal crisis of 1956, 6 Days War of 1967 between Egypt and Israel. 23. Unemployment persisted in Egypt due to failure to create more jobs to match with the increasing population. 24. Egypt experienced unfavorable balance of payments. This was attributed to the poor progress in the export trade and high expenditure on imported goods. Social effects. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. PAM. 27. Women emancipation was not fully achieved. Very few women were absorbed in the political circle. There were pockets of women's segregation in Egypt. 28. The government ban on the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt intensified the terrorist activities in the country. 29. The education system in Egypt led to overcrowding in classes due to the free education provided to the children. This watered down the quality of education. Political effects. 30. The revolution paved way for the dictatorial and authoritative regime of Gamal Nasser. 31. Political activity among the civilians was suppressed, and this led to the suffocation of people's rights and freedom. 32. The aggressive foreign policies of Gamal Nasser made Egypt to get more enemies, for example Israel, and this resulted into numerous wars between Egypt and Israel in Gauze province. 33. Nasser's Socialist Party failed by 1970 when he began cooperating with the capitalist bloc. Questions. 1. Examine the consequences of the 1952 Egyptian Revolution. 2. Assess the impact of the Egyptian Revolution on Egypt. 3. How successful was Gamal Nasser's domestic policy? 4. Assess the achievements of Gamal Nasser in Egypt between 1954 and 1917. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. PAM. The impact/role of the Egyptian Revolution to the growth of African nationalism. To what extent did the Egyptian Revolution influence the growth of African nationalism? The Egyptian Revolution took place in 1952, organized by the Free Officers movement led by Gamal Abdel Nasser and Sadat against the puppet regime of King Farouk. To a greater extent, the Egyptian Revolution contributed to the growth of African nationalism in the following ways. 1. The revolution led to the establishment of Radio Cairo. The radio was used to spread anti-colonial propaganda in Africa. This was used by the Mau Mau fighters in Kenya to run a Kiswahili program against the British. 2. The Egyptian Revolution served as an eye-opener to the dictatorial regime in Africa. It began with the destruction of the Egyptian monarchy and it spread across the continent, targeting colonial masters. 3. The Egyptian Revolution under Gamal Nasser extended the education scholarships to African students. This helped African nationalists from other countries to enroll in Egyptian universities. This in turn helped to fill up the manpower gaps in Africa after the departure of colonialists. 4. The Egyptian Revolution militarized African struggles for independence. Egypt under Gamal Nasser gave military and financial assistance to African countries like Kenya under the Mau Mau, Algeria under Ben Bella, leading to African independence. 5. Gamal allowed the nationalists to establish military external bases in Cairo. This included the FLN in Algeria, formed in 1954. Gaddafi had FU, or training in Egypt. 6. The Egyptian Revolution gave political asylum/protection to African nationalists. These included Ignatius Kenge Musisi from Uganda, Patrice Lumumba from Congo. This helped their countries to destroy the colonial powers, using Egypt as a coordinating center. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. PAM. 8. Gamal Nasser of Egypt contributed to the formation of OAU in 1963. This was a result of the reconciliation of the Monrovia and Casablanca grouping in Addis Ababa. The OAU gave financial and military support to African countries. 9. The Egyptian Revolution under Gamal Nasser encouraged the revival of African cultural values. This was done through encouraging African countries to practice local languages like Arabic, Kiswahili, Hausa, etc., which brought unity among the people. 10. Gamal Nasser of Egypt encouraged African countries to nationalize foreign property. This began with the nationalization of the Suez Canal in Egypt 1956, a chased the British from the country. Other countries were encouraged to do the same, for example, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, Idi Amin Dada of Uganda, and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. 11. Gamal Nasser of Egypt encouraged socialist policies. Socialist countries, particularly USSR, gave NASA military and financial support to solve its external problems after the removal of IMF/WB loan. Therefore, NASA encouraged other countries to solicit support from the socialist countries, for example Mozambique, Angola, and Algeria. 12. Gamal Nasser under Egypt influenced African countries to adopt non-aligned movement in AM. Nasser was part of the Bandung Conference organized in 1955 that advocated for independent African ideologies, promoted Afro-Asian solidarity that made Asian countries to support Africans to get independence. 13. Revolutionary Egypt helped to destroy the British and French empires. It is on record that Gamal Nasser gave the Algerians support in 1954, making them get independence in 1962, leading to the rise of African nationalism. Gamal Nasser's foreign policy 1954-1917. Gamal was one of the Free Officers movement that overthrew the puppet regime of King Farouk in 1952. He was first the Prime Minister of Egypt and later became President in 1954 after the African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today PAM. Nasser successfully sent expatriates to African countries to help fill the manpower gap after the departure of colonial masters. These expatriates included teachers, engineers, and doctors, for example in Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. Nasser promoted the use of African languages on the continent. This included Kiswahili, Arabic, and Hausa, among others, hence easing communication. Nasser succeeded in destabilizing the State of Israel. This was done through sponsoring the fierce Fedayeen commandos who destroyed the state of Tel Aviv and bombarded areas in the country. Nasser succeeded in providing scholarships to African students. The African nationalists from Algeria, Congo, Zaire, and other Arab states were allowed to study from Egyptian universities, i.e. Cairo and Alexandria. This helped to create a class of elites to destroy the colonial bondage in Africa. Gamal Nasser provided propaganda support to African nationalists. Nasser gave moral, military, and financial support to FLN of Algeria, the Mau Mau of Kenya, leading to independence. Nasser influenced the overflow of pro-Western leaders in Africa and Middle East. This included the overthrow of King Idris of Libya by Muammar Gaddafi, the Prime Minister of Iraq. Gamal Nasser gave moral and diplomatic support to Tunisia and Morocco against the French rule, which led to the twin independence of these countries in 1956. Nasser fully supported and promoted Pan-Arabism. It is on record that Nasser made Egypt to be the headquarters of the Arab League and proceeded to establish the United Arab Republic, i.e. Egypt and Syria, in 1958. Gamal Nasser was one of the founder members of the Organization of African Unity OAU in 1963. This was done through the reconciliation of the Casablanca and Monrovia groupings, leading to the total unity of Africans. Nasser succeeded in promoting the non-aligned movement NAM adopted in 1955 in Bandung. This was a conference organized by the Asian leaders, i.e. Nehru of India and Sukarno of Indonesia. The policy promoted positive neutrality in Africa and Afro-Asian solidarity. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today PAM. Nasser promoted research in the African past. He encouraged the writing and the reconstruction of African history, leading to the promotion of African cultural values. Nasser bridged the gap between the Arab North and Negro Africans. This changed the attitude of the blacks towards the Arabs, hence a success. Failures of Nasser's foreign policies. Nasser promoted conflicts among Arab states, and these included Morocco and Algeria. In this conflict, Nasser sided with Algeria, leading to political instabilities in North Africa. Nasser frustrated the formation of the United States of Africa, USA. This had been proposed by Kwame Nkrumah to bring the continent together under one leadership. Nasser failed to maintain the United Arab Republic with Syria. Syria seceded and broke away in 1961 due to Nasser's foreign policies. Nasser failed to maintain and stick to the policy of non-aligned movement adopted in 1955. The policy demanded that African countries, Egypt inclusive, do not follow socialism and capitalism. However, Nasser got financial aid from USSR and Czechoslovakia to construct the Aswan Dam. Nasser lost many provinces of Egypt to other countries. These included the West Bank of Jordan, the Golan Heights, the eastern parts of Suez Canal, the Sinai province during 6 Days War of 1969 with Israel. Gamal Nasser promoted political instabilities in Yemen and some parts of Saudi Arabia, hence undermining the principles of Pan-Arabism. Reference questions. 1. How successful was Gamal Abdel Nasser's foreign policy between 1954 and 1970? African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. PAM. Successes versus failures. The nationalization of the Suez Canal, July 1956. The nationalization of the Suez Canal referred to the transfer of the ownership, control, management and financing of the Suez Canal into the hands of the Egyptian government. It took place in July 1956. Reasons for the nationalization of the Suez Canal. The failure of the British to respect the 1936 Anglo-Egyptian Agreement. It should be recalled that the British entered an agreement to construct the canal, and upon completion, the British were to take 40% and the Egyptian economy was to take 60%. However, this was not respected, hence the nationalization. The strong anti-colonial feelings of Nasser contributed to the nationalization of the canal. This is evidenced when Nasser gave military and financial support to the Africans in Kenya against British and the FLN of Algeria against French. Nasser's recognition of the Bandung Conference contributed to the nationalization of the canal. The conference emphasized positive neutrality of Africans against colonial masters, i.e., capitalism, which was being preached by the British, hence the nationalization policy. The need to provide employment opportunities and generation of revenue compelled Nasser to nationalize the canal. Nasser reasoned that the expulsion of the British workers would create employment opportunities to the Egyptians. Egypt would be able to cross the canal, leading to nationalization. Nasser's arms deals with Czechoslovakia contributed to the nationalization policy. Czech Republic supported the policy of communism which had been embraced by Nasser, which contradicted with capitalism. This inevitably caused the nationalization policy. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. PAM. Nasser's wish to establish his superiority in Egypt and in the Middle East led to the nationalization policy. It should be noted that Nasser attempted to establish the Arab League, i.e., the composition of Arab countries in Africa and the Middle East, and to sustain this program required money, hence the nationalization principle. Nasser nationalized the canal for personal reasons and prestige. It ought to be noted that Nasser wanted to consolidate his power by generating money from the canal zone, hence nationalization policy. The need to increase the amount of the irrigatable land in Egypt made nationalization inevitable. There was need to generate water from the Suez Zone, Red Sea and Mediterranean Sea, hence the nationalization of the canal to ensure food security. The impact of the Constantinople Convention made the nationalization policy inevitable. Articles in the convention emphasized the respect for property of independent countries, and therefore Gamal Nasser based on the convention to nationalize the canal. Egypt's military skills in Africa contributed to the nationalization of the canal. It ought to be noted that Gamal Nasser had established a strong army which he used to support African nationalists. This military strength gave Nasser confidence to nationalize the canal. Reference questions. Account for the nationalization of the Suez Canal in 1956. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. PAM. The Suez Canal crisis, October 1956. QNS. 1. Account for the Suez Canal crisis of 1956. 2. Examine the causes and effect of 1956 Suez Canal crisis. 3. To what extent was the Tripartite Alliance responsible for the Suez Canal crisis in 1956? 4. Assess the impact of the Suez Canal War in 1956. 5. To what extent was Gamal Abdel Nasser responsible for the outbreak of the 1956 Suez Canal crisis? 6. Why was the Suez Canal nationalized in 1956? 7. Explain the causes and effects of the Suez Canal nationalization. It was a conflict that took place in 1956 when Britain, France and Israel conspired to attack and overthrow Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, who had nationalized the Suez Canal. It was an imperialistic and aggressive war on the side of Allied powers and a war of liberation war for Egypt. Causes. Israel attacked Egypt on 29 October 1956 and occupied the Sinai Peninsula, marking the beginning of the crisis. So the crisis was due to the following factors. Nasser's support to Fedayeen commandos against Israel caused the canal crisis. So between 1954 and 55, Nasser organized the Fedayeen guerrillas and carried out sabotage acts on important installations in Israel and destroyed property and killed people. This provoked Israel and attacked Egypt in 1956, and the city of Tel Aviv was left in shambles. The British and French secret assurance of support to Israel caused the canal crisis. This assurance made Israel courageous and convinced her to occupy the Sinai Peninsula on 29 October 1956. This compelled Nasser to respond militarily, and on 5 November 1956 the Anglo-French forces intervened to assist Israel against Egypt. This escalated the attack into a full-scale crisis. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. PAM. Nasser's consistent demand that British should remove her military base from the Suez Canal zone as provided for in 1954 Anglo-Egyptian Agreement caused the crisis. However, the British were not set to leave the canal zone for strategic military interests. This provoked anti-Nasser reactions in form of Anglo-French attack. The nationalization of the Suez Canal resulted into the Canal Crisis of 1956. Nasser took over control of the Suez Canal activities to the annoyance of Britain and France. The nationalization threatened Anglo-French economic interests, for the Suez Canal was the shortest route for Britain and France to the oil-producing states of the Persian Gulf. Therefore, Britain and France were not prepared to give up control of the Canal of Egypt. This resulted into the Canal Crisis. Nasser's rejection of the Free Users Association of the Suez Canal caused the Suez Canal saga. Britain and France suggested the formation of the association to protect their interests in the Canal Zone, but Nasser rejected it for fear of losing revenue. This made France and Britain to decide that Nasser should be overthrown at all costs for free use of canal services. Nasser's financial, military and moral support to the National Liberation Front FLN of Algeria provoked France to conspire with Britain and Israel to cause the Suez Canal crisis. When Nasser started giving support to FLN freedom fighters in the War of Independence, France felt antagonized and plotted to overthrow Nasser in order to continue perpetuating their colonialism in Algeria. Nasser's strong support for anti-British rebels in Cyprus and in the Mau Mau activists in Kenya caused the Suez Canal crisis. Nasser used Radio Cairo to propagate anti-colonial propaganda of the Mau Mau, supplied war logistics to the Ayuka rebels in Cyprus, etc. This threatened British colonial interests and angered her to the extent of conspiring against Nasser's government. Nasser's anti-British influence in Jordan resulted into the Canal Crisis. Nasser persuaded King African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today PAM. Nasser's recognition of the communist regime of Mao Zedong in Peking and the denouncement of the Western-backed nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek on the island of Taiwan resulted into the crisis. This was seen as a gesture of defiance against the capitalists, thus prompting them to ally against Nasser's government. Nasser's arms deal with the communist Czech Republic for Russian bombers and tanks caused the crisis. Nasser also invited the Soviet experts to train Egyptian soldiers. This military advance of Egypt within the communists angered the Western powers, making them conspire against Nasser's government. The influence of the Bandung Conference of 1955 on Nasser caused the Canal Crisis. Nasser, as a delegate to the Bandung Conference, came back and called for total eradication of all forms of colonialism. He was inspired to nationalize the Suez Canal, which was the last part of British colonialism. Thus, Britain teamed up with France and Israel to fight the government of Nasser. The withdrawal of financial assistance meant for the construction of Aswan High Dam, which was of the center stage of economic development of Egypt, caused the Canal Crisis. Britain and U.S. withheld substantial loan amounts meant for the dam construction and left Nasser with no option but nationalizing the Suez Canal to get revenue from the canal to construct the Aswan High Dam. Nasser's desire to fix Egypt's economic problems led to the Caire Crisis in 1956. Egypt's rights to 15% of the net profit from the Suez Canal as rent for the territory was sold away by the British and the French, thus millions of pounds flowed to Britain and France without a single penny going into Egypt's treasury. This did not please the people of Egypt, forcing them to nationalize the Suez Canal to end economic hemorrhage/plunder. However, this provoked Anglo-France attack of Egypt. Nasser's Pan-Africanist nationalism caused the Canal Crisis. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today PAM. His domestic reforms, which have socialistic in nature. His recognition of Palestine and opposition of Israel as a state. Nasser's attendance of the Bandung Conference of 1955. Nasser's rejection of the Free Users Association. Nasser's support to the Fedayeen commandos. Nasser's September 1955 arms deal with communist CZ rep. Nasser's anti-British influence in the Arab states, e.g., Jordan. Nasser's financial and military support to FLN of Ben Bella. Nasser's Pan-Africanist nationalism. Nasser's opposition to the Baghdad Pact of 1955. Nasser's anti-British rebel support in Cyprus. His recognition of Mao Zedong communist regime. Nasser's desire to fix Egypt's economic problems. Nasser's blockade of the Gulf of Aqaba. Nationalization of the Suez Canal by Nasser. Other factors. The British violation of the 1936 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty, which required them to leave Egypt in 1956 after 20 years. Britain's fear to lose 40% revenue that it was getting from the canal. The British and the French secret assurance of support to Israel. Britain and USA's withdrawal of millions of dollars loan which had promised to Egypt for the Aswan High Dam project. The strategic location of the canal to all parties, i.e. France and Britain, Israel and Egypt. Israel's desire to expand her imperial ambitions to Africa/desire to spread the Zionist ideology. Anti-British feelings in Egypt by the Egyptians by 1956/desire for full independence. Israel's attack on Egypt's territory, i.e. Sinai Peninsula, on 29 October 1956. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today PAM. Impact of the Suez Canal Crisis. The Suez Canal War was a military conflict between Egypt on the one side against Israel, Britain and France on the other side in 1956. Positive impact on Egypt. Egypt registered a diplomatic victory over the British, French and Israel. The Anglo-French invasion of Egypt evoked strong condemnation from the international opinion expressed from the UN support of Nasser, even from the I Love You essay. Egypt's self-rule became more meaningful. The Anglo-French troops were forced to withdraw from Egypt, thus complete independence was realized. Nasser became a celebrated hero in the Middle East states and Egypt itself. Nasser's portraits were placed on many streets, were named after Nasser, and Nasser's portraits became a household property. Egypt gained full control of the canal. Under international pressure, the Anglo-French troops were forced to withdraw, leaving the canal in the hands of Egypt. The canal was well managed under Egyptian managers, traffic increased, generated a lot of employment and revenue. Egyptian nationalism was strengthened as people united behind Nasser to get rid of foreign rule. Nationalization policy was intensified. Nasser was incited to take over British and French property in Egypt as compensation for Anglo-French subversion imperialistic tendencies. It laid a foundation for the success of the Aswan High Dam project. It was constructed using revenue generated from the canal with some support from USSR. This made Egypt the first African country to put radical socialist policies into practice. Socialism was spread in Egypt, which implied more aid from the socialist countries, e.g. USSR, China, Czech Republic. There was efficient administration of the canal after the war. This was in the hands of Egyptian engineers. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. It led to the opening of the Gulf of Aqaba, which benefited Israel. She regained entrance and exit for her trade and tried to improve the strained relationship. It laid a foundation for aid to other nationalists like Ben Bella Ahmed from Nasser, and this catapulted the quick self-determination from the French in 1962. Egyptian diplomatic victory during the Canal War inspired nationalism elsewhere, e.g. Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco twin independence in 1956. It enabled the UN to register an achievement. It condemned the Anglo-French invasion of Egypt and called for their withdrawal by petitioning the UN Security Council to take charge. It resulted into the promotion of Pan-Arabism, i.e. creation of the United Arab Republic Egypt plus Syria in 1958 UAR. Afro-Asian states turned to the East as an ally in fighting colonialism. They solicited for support from the communist bloc, e.g. USSR, China, and Czech Republic, etc. Inspired political development in Francophone states. In 1958, the Fourth Republic of France was overthrown by Charles de Gaulle and immediately organized a referendum for the Africans to decide/determine their political future. De Gaulle referendum that made Sekou Touré to vote for no, that deliberately destroyed the French Federation. The spirit of NAM was strengthened. Nasser was established as one of the defenders and leaders of NAM, convincing African countries to adopt the principles of NAM that emphasized the positive neutrality on the continent and adoption of independent ideology. The resignation of the British Prime Minister Sir Anthony Eden and 3 members of his cabinet led to the freezing of British and French military equipments, which were channeled to the liberation movements. Large consignments of arms and ammunition, especially rifles got from the withdrawing Anglo-French forces, were sent to African guerrilla fighters. Negative impact. There was massive destruction of life and property. For example, in the Sinai battle alone, 3,000 soldiers were killed and vast quantities of equipment lost to Israel. Egypt was forced to withdraw from Sinai and Gaza and was taken over by Israel, and even the military post of Sham al-Sheil in southern Sinai was taken over. However, Israel later withdrew. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. Refugee crisis in the Canal Zone was witnessed, and this led to increased misery and suffering. There was reduction in revenue to Egypt, or traffic was diverted to the Cape, and this was attributed to the wars that Nasser fought and lowered the morale of investors. Increased hostility between Egypt and Israel, leading to the 1967-68 war, in which Egypt lost more territories. NAM principles were undermined by Nasser's adoption of socialism. Principles of neutrality were abandoned, and this affected the credibility of African complete independence from the colonial hegemony. Led to suffocation of Israel's trade in Africa and the Middle East. This was because she had tampered with Egypt under Nasser, who was seen as a focal point/figure of nationalism. NATO members were divided, especially those who blamed Britain and France, e.g. US, identified with Nasser and blamed the Anglo-French attack of Egypt, and also compelled France to withdraw temporarily from NATO in 1966. Led to the oil crisis in the world, which resulted in the collapse of world economies and overthrow of many African governments, i.e. between 1960s and 1970s. It also affected regional bodies as Arab countries cut off relations with Western allies, i.e. EAC collapsed in 1977. Intensified Cold War politics in Africa, and this partly delayed the attainment of independence of African countries like Portuguese colonies in South Africa. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. The East African Community, EAC. The East African Community was formed/established on 6 June 1967 after signing the Arusha Treaty by the heads of President Jomo Kenyatta Kenya, Julius Nyerere Tanzania, and Milton Obote Uganda. It was under the guidance of K.J.L. Phillips, a United Nations professor and expert in international relations, and the treaty came into effect operation on 1 December 1967. Aims/objectives of EEC. 1. To strengthen political ties between the three countries. 2. To promote balanced regional economic development. 3. To promote the adoption of a common currency that would ease commercial transactions. 4. To ease the mobility of resources, goods, and services and eliminate restrictions. 5. To promote trade among the member states. 6. To expand the market for the goods produced in the region. 7. To reduce the duplication of goods and services among the member states. 8. To foster cooperation and unity among the East African states. 9. To mobilize financial support from international organizations and fight neocolonialism. 10. To safeguard the sovereignty and territorial integrity of East African states. Achievements of EAC. African history. The Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. PAM. The body established a common market in the region that in turn promoted regional economic development. The EAC established common services in the region. Tanzania became the headquarters of the Harbours Cooperation in Dar es Salaam and headquarters of Community at Arusha. Uganda, the East African Posts and Telecommunications, and EDB in Kampala. Kenya had the East African Airways and Railways in Nairobi, hence decentralization promoted. The body ensured and promoted regional unity and cooperation among member states. This guaranteed uniform problem-solving in East Africa than what existed in the East African Federation. Diplomatic relations were equally promoted in the region. Member states occasionally met to address their regional problems. The body promoted employment opportunities in the cooperation set up like the railway. EDB, East African Harbours, the ELA, the EA that raised the standard of living of the people. The EAC harmonized trade and commerce in its initial stages. This was done through the reduction of the trade barriers among the three states. The EAC promoted industrialization in the region. These included the circled and plain aluminium sheets, radio assembly and manufactures of motor vehicle tires and tubes in Tanzania. Kenya produced bulbs. These generated local revenue and employment provision. The body established the East African Development Bank (EDB) that promoted balanced development. The bank extended loans to member states for setting up projects, provided technical assistance, and solicited for financial support from international organizations. The EAC promoted the easy mobility of East African citizens and goods. The corporation established encouraged people to work freely in the three countries, e.g., the railways, airways industries, the bank, among others. The community promoted the spirit of Pan-African. The movement advocated for regional integrity, and this was enshrined in EAC, and problems were uniformly solved. The EAC opened room for the incorporation and inclusion of other states to broaden its African history. The Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. PAM. The EAC promoted specialization among member states. This was reflected in the projects set up like the industries of fertilizers in Uganda, electric bulbs in Kenya, airways in Kenya, and even the agriculturally based projects, e.g., sisal for Tanzania, pyrethrum in Kenya, and coffee in Uganda. The EAC linked the three countries to the World Economic Systems organizations. These included EEC, UNO for purposes of comparison and effective implementation and realization of the set objectives. The body established infrastructure in the region. These included the East African Railways, airlined roads to promote development as precursors to harness the resources. The body also streamlined education in the region that increased the literacy rate. Regional universities were set up, e.g., Makere University in Uganda, Dar es Salaam University, and Kenyatta University in Kenya. This allowed all people in the region to acquire education and all without restrictions. Also examination boards, e.g., EEC to regulate performance. The EAC tried to harmonize the currency exchange in the region, and all were using the shillings. The level of exchange was checked in the initial stages that limited the conflicts. The body established the East African Court of Appeal and councils of tribunals. These helped to check on the excesses of the leaders and promote the proper operation of the organization. Pertaining industrial disputes related to staff. The body too promoted the setting up of the East African Legislative Assembly. This was composed of the chairperson, the general secretary, ministers from the partner states. Research was promoted in East Africa through the EAC. This was a branch of the council. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. PAM. Failure of the relations among the heads of state, e.g., Amin conflicted with Nyerere due to the 1971 coup, and Nyerere vowed never to sit with Amin on the same table. The EAA, the top body of heads of state, failed to meet with the rise of Amin. The member states failed to respect the principle of regional economic cooperation and adopted protectionism, i.e., not allowing other goods to flow from other countries. The member states failed to expand the membership, and yet this had been proposed. The EAC leadership failed to control the bickering among the heads of states, e.g., Amin, Nauru and Kenyatta. Failure to control neo-colonialism. Failure to ensure even and balanced distribution of the benefits, e.g., Kenya was progressing at a faster rate. Failure to punish and reprimand members who failed to pay up their subscriptions, e.g., Uganda and Tanzania. Economic nationalism and duplication of industries, e.g., Uganda had to specialize in sugar industry, but Kenya also started. Other countries like Uganda and Tanzania began producing tires and set up plants meant for Kenya. Lack of harmony in tax policies by 1974, etc. Failure to control corruption in the set-up corporations. Member states failed to establish a uniform currency. There was nationalization of the currencies, and it presented a problem to members in different countries to purchase products due to failure to accept money as legal tenders. Failure to control individualism and prestige of heads of state regarding appointments. Squabbles came up over appointments and expulsions of Kenyans from Tanzania. This made projects to break up, e.g., in 1976, airways in each country all wanted to own a bank, university, and railway sharing. Failed to stop misunderstandings over the transport sector. This made Tanzania in 1973 to manage its railway system. Kenya was blamed for developing road transport to weaken African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date, PAM. To what extent did the EAC achieve the objectives of its founders by 1977? 3. How successful was the EAC in fulfilling the objectives of its founders between 1967 and 1977? Approach. Brief introduction, i.e., year, members involved, aims outlined, clear standpoint, achievements vs failures. 4. To what extent did the economic factors lead to the collapse of the East African community by 1977? Brief introduction. Role of economic factors. Other factors. Standpoint needed. Points to consider: economic duplication of industries. Trade diversion, trading with other countries outside the EAC, Tanzania with USA. Trade protectionism or economic nationalism, i.e., Tanzania and Uganda levying high taxes on Kenya goods to protect their infant industries. Small membership that narrowed the market and financial obligations to fund projects, e.g., EDB. Consumption of poor quality products, expensively mostly from Kenya. Lack of a common and accepted currency. This made life hard for non-citizens in the African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date, PAM. The economic sabotage and meddling by the multinational companies, hence dumping of cheaper products. Failure of member states to respect their subscription/obligations that dwindled progress. The unfair competition for foreign investors that made Kenya to where many. The oil crisis of 1973-74 drastically affected the region and world at large. Arab oil-producing countries cut off supporters of Israel and USA companies like Shell. Egypt culture to originate from Britain, to which EAC was affiliated, and this led to breakdown of economy and retrenchment. Other factors include the weaknesses of a EU continental body that would prevail over the bickering. Border conflicts, i.e., Amin around the Kagera region and Kisumu, Tanzania closed border in 1976 to deny Kenya imports. Ideological differences among the members, i.e., Tanzania had adopted socialism that demanded collective ownership of resources, i.e., state control, etc. Kenya was mixed but majorly capitalized. Personal rivalry between the heads of state, i.e., Amin vs Nauru, and Nauru vowed not to sit with the buffoon, blood-stained Amin, and EAA not to convene. The 1971 coup in Uganda's last rise of Amin to power, i.e., no background to EAC, refused to pay subscription, expelled the Asians, workers of the community, etc. Selfish national interests among the member countries and members employed no interest of the EAC at heart. Lack of goodwill from the citizens/personalization of the EAC by the leaders like Jomo Kenyatta. Given the level of development, Nauru did not want to be opposed. Political immorality. Amin and Nauru referred to each other as women to marry. Nauru referred to Amin as an illiterate and buffoon, and Kenyatta was called a political prostitute, hence tearing the EAC. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date, PAM. Language barrier. Kenya and Tanzania felt comfortable with Kiswahili, which disadvantaged Uganda. Question 1. 1977. Discuss. 2. Amin Idi Dada made the collapse of the EAC in 1977 inevitable. Discuss. Brief introduction. Role of Amin/coup of 1971. Other factors. Clear standpoint. Points to consider. Amin overthrew Obote, who was a founder member of EAC. Accelerated misunderstandings between members, e.g., between Uganda vs Kenya Kisumu area, Uganda Tanzania over Kagera area. The Economic War of 1972 led to loss of revenue and industrial experts. Amin dismissed/expelled Tanzania workers over 45,000 people and a December senior worker in EAA and major department of EAC. Amin promoted trade malpractices like smuggling that led to tax evasion. Dictatorship of Amin/maladministration affected the activities of EAC. Amin contributed to the collapse of the economy not to pay the subscription obligations. Amin accelerated corruption, which dwindled the operation of EAC. The come into power by Amin sabotaged the communications which hindered the operations of EAC. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. PAM. No prior knowledge and experience by the members. Limited membership or narrow market. Failure to involve members in the operations from all countries. Duplication of industries and services by Kenya. Trade diversion. Unbalanced benefits. Completion of the Tazara Railway. Financial hardships or lack of adequate funds due to limited reserves in EDB. Economic nationalism or protectionism. Weaknesses of OAU. International interference, e.g., European Economic Community. Language barrier. Lack of a regionally accepted currency that limited transactions, etc. Question. Restoration of Ethiopian independence from Italy in 1941. Ethiopia had lost its independence in 1936 when Italy occupied it after defeating the monarchy that forced Emperor Haile Selassie to exile. Factors include the formation of the Black Lions movement, the application of the guerrilla tactics against the Italians, the brutality imposed on Ethiopians by Italians increased anger, e.g., the 1937 Graziani massacres, execution of Bishop Petros in 1938, etc. The determination of the Ethiopians to get rid of Italians, the able leadership provided by RAS and Ruru, role of the Orthodox Church that was patriotic vehemently opposed to Italians. Tactical escape of Emperor Haile Selassie to exile in England turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Italy's blunder of joining World War II on the side of Germany annoyed Britain. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. PAM. Massive assistance rendered to Ethiopia from fellow African countries, e.g., Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Kenya. The role of the Rastafarian movement. Assistance from the gallant veterans of Ado battle, e.g., Razmulagada, Zerai Deris, etc. The role of the Wasi from West Africa that was violent against imperialism in Africa. The home geographical advantage enjoyed by Ethiopians, i.e., mountains, were unfamiliar to Italians. Numerical strength of the Ethiopians compared to the Italians. Hostile press attacks against Italian rule in Ethiopia worldwide. The widespread black demonstrations against Italian rule in Ethiopia. The strong sense of unity and patriotism displayed by Ethiopians against Italians after the 1935 invasion. Role of various anti-colonial movements, e.g., the IASP, Abyssinian Association, Pan-African Federation, PAF. Commitment of the educated elites and the blacks in the diaspora to the cause of Ethiopia, e.g., Ras Makonnen from Guyana, George Padmore from Trinidad and Tobago. Support from Britain and France against Italy, BR through Sudan and Kenya. The international sympathy extended to Ethiopia when the Emperor Selassie fled to exile. The concept of non-aligned movement, NAM. The non-aligned movement was founded during the collapse of the colonial systems in Africa, Asia, Latin America and other parts of the world. It emerged at the height of Cold War politics that had established military blocs of NATO 1949. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. PAM. The NAM idea was conceived in 1955 at Bandung Conference organized by the Indonesian President Sukarno, Jawaharlal Nehru, the Premier of India, and Gamal Nasser, the President of Egypt. The concept of NAM at Bandung was composed of a delegation of 29 members from India, Indonesia, China, Egypt, Algeria, and Ghana, among others. It became official in 1961 at the Belgrade Summit in Yugoslavia with Joseph Broz Tito as its first General Secretary. Aims and objectives of NAM. Reference question 1. Account for the adoption of the non-alignment policy by independent African states. UNEB 2006. 2. Why was the non-aligned movement NAM formed in 1955? UNEB 2011. The aims of non-aligned movement included the following. 1. To maintain world peace by promoting non-violent means and reject the use of force. 2. To support self-determination and national independence in the Third World, reject all forms of imperialism. 3. To safeguard the sovereignty of the member states against the domination by the upper powers, i.e., encouraging the independence of the non-aligned nations from Cold War politics. 4. To discourage military alliances and push for the disarmament of the superpowers to decelerate world conflicts. 5. To promote economic independence of the member states. 6. The desire to encourage active participation of non-aligned states Third World in the African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 to date. PAM. 9. To promote the South-South cooperation, i.e., the cooperation among the Third World nations with mutual understanding and tolerance. 10. To ensure the peaceful coexistence among all nations of the world, i.e., democratize international relations. 11. The desire to reject all forms of racial discrimination like apartheid and Zionism, Israel-related movement. 12. To encourage the respect for human rights as contained in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights Charter of UN adopted in 1948. 13. To ensure the peaceful resolution of disputes in the world without resorting to wars that had shattered world economies. 14. To oppose and castigate in union the stationing of military bases in the foreign countries. This had been done by the members of NATO having satellites in African countries' information-gathering gadgets. Successes/achievements of NAM. 1. The non-aligned movement has had a long period of existence since 1961 as inaugural year. The movement has been in existence for over 55 years, and this is attributed to the numerous conferences held, i.e., from Belgrade, the attendance to the UN General Assemblies, hence consolidating its day. 2. The movement has expanded its membership by attracting many developing countries. This was attained after the attainment of independence by many African and Asian countries from 29 members to over 100 countries. The last members to join included Fiji from Oceania and Azerbaijan of Asia in 2011 respectively. 3. The NAM greatly contributed to the world peace and stability. The movement contained the Cold War politics that had threatened world peace. It condemned the arms race by the superpowers through supporting the strategic arms limitation talks SALT and strategic arms reduction talks START. These castigated the production of nuclear weapons that reduced militarization by creating peace. 4. The NAM greatly led to the collapse of Cold War politics with superpowers. The member states continued with the policy of neutrality and castigated the arms race of the superpowers. The members of NAM used the platform of the UN to isolate the ideological African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today PAM. Wars of USA and USSR. The NAM also led to the collapse of the Berlin Wall and reunified Germany, leading to peace. 5. The NAM advocated for the reformation of the United Nations, hence making it more effective. NAM openly criticized the structures of the UN structure and power dynamics. The Security Council of the United Nations was highly criticized of being undemocratic and asked the UN to reshape its structures to promote international democracy. 6. NAM contributed for the respect of small states in the world. The weight of small states was increased not to be dominated by the superpowers. This completed USA to work with the NAM member countries to fight terrorism in the world and kept peace in Yugoslavia, Somalia, etc. 7. Non-alignment has promoted unity and cooperation among member states. This ensured the South-South cooperation of the Third World nations. This ensured a united front of member states to have a stronger voice in the UN General Assembly to reduce the dominance of the superpowers. 8. NAM was instrumental in the promotion of Afro-Asian solidarity. The mutual cooperation between Africans and Asians became official at the Bandung Conference. The idea of solidarity was further propagated to the subsequent conferences like the Belgrade of 1961 and 1979 Lusaka Conference. 9. The non-alignment policy promoted economic relations among states. The NAM nations have extended financial and technical assistance to member states. The NAM powers like India, Indonesia, UAE, Saudi Arabia provided funds and technical expertise to the projects in weaker states e.g. Angola, Uganda and Tanzania. The movement boosted confidence among the weaker states to distance themselves from the superpowers. Then, the NAM led to the establishment of the South-South Commission in 1988. The African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today PAM. Other injustices of the big states against the small states. The NAM condemned the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1981 and also condemned the unhealthy and senseless assassination of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. 12. The NAM contributed to the development of African nationalism. The members of NAM used the platform of UN to voice out anti-colonial sentiments against imperialism. It demanded the intervention of the UN to impose sanctions of colonial masters, made Africans to become recommitted to independence. 13. Non-alignment condemned racial discrimination and dominance in the world. The spirit of the movement fought the racist apartheid policy in South Africa and the UDI government of Southern Rhodesia. Member states extended military and financial support to the blacks to fight the whites. The movement also pressurized the UN to intervene in the Palestinian question against Zionist Israel. 14. NAM has attempted to intervene in the conflict among member states. It condemned the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq and mediated in the Pakistan conflict. The members tried to arbitrate in the Sudan conflict that ended the conflict that started in 1955. This finally led to the independence of South Sudan in 2011. 15. The non-aligned nations have tried to promote the respect of human rights. This has been done in line with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights Order of the UN that advocated for equality of people. The policy also condemned the aggression of the powerful nations and promoted justice and respect in cultural diversity. Cross-cultural management. 16. Members of the non-aligned movement have continuously emphasized democracy and establishment of people's governments. It condemned dictatorial regimes of Idi Amin in Uganda, Saddam regime in Iraq, among others. The movement calls for the peaceful handover of power through constitutional and democratic means. The NAM nations have collectively African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today. PAM. Weaknesses/failures of NAM. 1. The movement has failed to solve interstate conflicts among the non-aligned nations. Conflicts and misunderstandings have existed between India and Pakistan, Iraq and Kuwait, Uganda and Sudan, the Congo question which caused tension between Uganda, the Kabila government and Rwanda. 2. The NAM failed in its attempt to maintain political stability and security of its member states. Many military coups and civil wars have existed in African states like Congo, Uganda, Sudan, Asian countries like Iraq, Lebanon, Syria and Afghanistan. This affected peace in these nations, rendering the movement ineffective. 3. NAM has failed to develop into a body that can threaten the world power blocs. The Eastern and Western blocs have continued to exist even after the Cold War politics, leading to a new trend of imperialism. It is true the NAM is a big organization of next to UN, but it has been undermined by the power blocs and it has remained inferior in international conventions. 4. The NAM failed to uphold the principle of positive neutrality. The member states have ended up identifying with foreign ideologies of capitalism and communism. This has perpetuated neocolonialism, undermining the independence of the states. 5. The NAM has failed to prevent ideological conflicts among the member states. Conflicts have occurred among members. The bigger nations have undermined the proceedings forwarded by non-aligned members for the weaker states. This has affected the process of finding a common approach to the problems of the world and hindering solidarity. 6. The movement has failed in its endeavors to improve on the living conditions of the people of its member states. Majority of the non-aligned member states have been increasingly affected by the high levels of ignorance, disease, poverty, starvation and other socio-economic problems. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today. PAM. Morocco and Ben Ali of Tunisia, Joseph Kabila of Dr. Congo and Paul Kagame of Rwanda, among others. 9. The NAM has failed to condemn militarization of the great powers in the non-aligned countries. The major world powers have since 1990s acted aggressively on NAM nations, e.g. France tested its nuclear bomb in the Sahara, US bombardment of Benghazi in Libya in the 1980s, NAM members only verbally condemned without practical solutions. Also, this militarism was extended in Libya in 2011 by the NATO explosions that saw the death of Gaddafi. 10. Non-aligned members have failed to prevent the influence of Western cultures. The native cultural heritage has been eroded by Western imperialism, leading to dubious Western acts like homosexuality and gay marriage. Money has been poured in NAM countries to promote such acts due to economic desperateness. 11. Some member states of NAM have allowed the bigger powers to establish military bases in their territories. These include Pakistan, Egypt, Kenya, Qatar, Iraq, among others. This has undermined the sovereign integrity that the movement desired to promote. 12. Non-aligned states have become breeding grounds for the terrorist activities in the world, hence a failure. Terrorism has been harbored, organized, and unleashed using the aligned states like Sudan, Somalia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Osama bin Laden, the leader of the Al-Qaeda, was assassinated in Pakistan, which is a strong supporter of NAM. This followed the September 2011 attack on USA of the Trade Center. Problems or challenges of NAM. 1. Persistent poverty and economic backwardness. 2. Ideological differences creating mistrust among members. 4. Neocolonialism. 4. Political instabilities hindering progress. 5. The end of Cold War that left the movement with no enemy to fight. 6. Lack of a proper definition of NAM, so Kano looked at it as containing Cold War vs. Naira for self-determination of weaker nations, variant-affected decisions. 7. Foreign supervision and patronage by great powers, i.e. Cuba used USSR, Kenya with USA. African history, the Pan-African movement since 1900 today. PAM. 8. NAM states are affiliated to other groups or organizations, e.g. OU, OPEC, regional bodies, ECOWAS, Arab League. This creates conflicting loyalty. 9. The persistent interstate conflicts create disunity and disharmony. 10. The death of core members like Nkrumah, Nehru, and leaving active politics. Nasser died in 1970. The new generation leaders lack initial vision. 11. Other member states are either driven by personal or national interests, e.g. Nasser joined To promote pan-Arabism, Yugoslavia joined to reduce the Cold War tension and promote country security, etc. Wide operation area of NAM. The members of the South included Asian, African, South America and parts of North America, i.e. the Caribbean/West Indies.